East Penn, the May 9th meeting of the East Penn Board of Supervisors is hereby called to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
March 9th.
Did I say what?
May 9th.
March 9th. I'm getting ahead of myself. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The first order of business is request to address the board. I have none. So moving on to approval of minutes. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Next is a performance. Mrs. Campbell.
It's not very often that we have student groups that reach out to us and say, can we come to a board meeting? So I want to first say thank you to the LMMS Jazz Band members for expressing your interest in coming and performing for us tonight. But they are an amazing group of talented musicians. I know that their director, Ms. Erin Troutman, who's here this evening, is so very proud of them. And they really wanted to take this opportunity to showcase their work for the board as well as the community. So without any further ado, I'll turn the beginning part of our meeting over to the LMMS Jazz Band.
All right, we have two selections for you today. The first is, you probably recognize, it's called Sweet George Brown, and the second one is Blue and Sapphire. This is our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students. We rehearsed on Tuesday afternoon, and they really are such a great you'll enjoy what we have to share.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
While they're packing up and moving out, what?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's always good to hear from the student performances
Yeah,
at the board
best
meeting.
part of being on the board.
What? I missed that.
Little pre-budget music.
Play, yeah, in the mood.
All right. Now down to the end.
Next on the agenda is the final budget priorities presentation.
Good evening. Yes, tonight we are bringing you a final overview of our preliminary budget priorities. And so several members of our administrative team and I will give you a highlight of the administrative positions that we have identified as priorities for the budget for 2020-21. And then following that presentation, Mr. Saul will provide an overview of our long-range plan as well. Again, it's important for us to always continually remind ourselves in terms of our goal that really drives our budget process, and that would be to continue to expand those educational opportunities that we have for our students while also sustaining the financial health of the school district in both the short and long term. And specifically this evening, we're going to be looking at 2 administrative level positions that as a team, meaning both a district team as well as a building team, as we begin to look and identify needs and priorities within the organization. These are 2 priority areas for which we continue to see a need for leadership and administration. When we think about the cost of those 2 positions to the district, one of which is we have tentatively identified it as a director level position, so the director of educational alternatives. You can see the approximate salary and benefits for that position. And then the other position is an inclusion specialist, also a K-12 or district-wide position, and we envision that position likely to be a supervisor level position, specifically working within as a liaison between special education and regular education. And you'll note again that those are recurring costs. So I'll begin with providing a high-level overview of the Director of Educational Alternatives position, and then joining me to potentially delve into some of the programs with which that particular director would work. Laura Whitman will then be going over some of that information. So to begin, in terms of the Director of Educational Alternatives, really our vision for that position is that leader will improve our current alternative educational programs that we currently offer students in East Penn. And we're going to talk about what those current programs are. In addition to improving our current programs, we also would like to continue to develop new alternative programs or learning opportunities that appropriately address the needs of our learners. So within that vision, when we then drill down a bit more and we think about the responsibilities or the key priorities that individual would lead, the first would be our cyber as well as blended learning. And in just a couple minutes, Ms. Whitman is going to talk a little bit about the cyber program that we currently offer that primarily services our high school students at this point. Another priority, or a second priority for the Director of Educational Alternatives, would be our Learning to Succeed program, which again is exclusively for our high school juniors and seniors. We also will talk to you tonight about a variety of disciplinary placements that we currently implement, and we believe that the Director of Educational Alternatives would potentially take a much more proactive and restorative approach to discipline as opposed to potentially punitive or reactionary. The other priority for our Director of Educational Alternatives would be a variety of alternative educational placements that we currently support for both regular education, as well as we're going to talk briefly about some special education programs, but in particular we'll focus on those regular ed students, I should say, whose needs we are not able to meet here, who we then have to place in an outside placement outside of East Penn. And then finally, another priority for the position would be an internship program. And when you think about programs such as Jasper that you heard about earlier this fall, we talked about the types of learning opportunities that we would like to provide high school students in terms of having meaningful connections and internship opportunities within the East Penn community. And so we'd like to offer an internship program not just for students within the Jasper program. And then you're also going to, we'll talk a little bit as well in terms of not only the current educational programs, but what we envision in terms of some of those new opportunities that we'd like to offer students. So now to talk us through some of those current programs, gives me great pleasure to welcome Laura Whitman.
Hi. So as you can recall, the first 2 programs that are up here currently are programs that started as the high school grew.
There was formerly a team of 6 assistant principals and a head principal, and they had given rise to those programs. VESPA was formerly known as the East Penn Cyber Learning Academy. That had 30 students in 2015 when I took over in my position in curriculum, and we've grown that to 87. At its peak, it was 107. The LTS program was also born at the high school. That program, again, is intended for credit recovery. It's open to specific juniors and seniors. That's decided by a team that also involves their counselor, their assistant principal, as to whether or not that's an appropriate placement as it is now. It's a face-to-face program. Teachers are going there after school to meet with students, and right now it serves 22 students. At its peak last year, it served 31. We currently, in terms of our discipline rooms, we have an in-school suspension room. It's staffed by 1 staff assistant. It's meant for internal placements of students for discipline reasons that are very clear in our discipline code. It served 117 unique students last year, some of them on multiple occasions. The out-of-school suspension is an unsupervised, prohibited from buildings and grounds for up to 10 days. Again, that's anywhere typically from, well, it can be 1 to 10 days of out-of-school suspension. Again, in combination, that served 139 unique students, but also 70 who were also in-school suspension. When you look at outside placements, the outside placements are for various reasons. And so for regular education, we had 40 students last year who were placed in an outside placement, and in emotional support, we had another additional 49. The new programs that we'd want to talk about or discuss with the board in the future are the extension of our cyber program to our middle level cyber grades. That's very hard to facilitate without, again, a leader in charge of that cyber program. We do get requests often for various reasons from middle level students. The other program that we would love to have in our secondary level buildings is a transition program for our students. We have many students for various reasons who experience an outside placement during the school year. And the transition program allows students to resume that schedule, not just in a sink or swim fashion. Especially some of those programs that I'm discussing, the time and length of time that students are in those programs has to do with health or some of those other issues, and not necessarily their readiness to quickly resume that full schedule. And then the internship program is something to celebrate for Emmaus High School students, where we'd like to have somebody to be able to oversee the placement of students in outside community organizations and outside corporations so that they get a real working experience as they decide to make decisions about their career in college.
Before we move into the inclusion specialist position, we thought this might be an appropriate time to stop and answer any questions that might be specific to the Director of Educational Alternatives before we then move into the special ed position.
Ms. Bowman?
Why a director level and not, I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of things that I don't really know. Some of them are not smart probably, but why not a vice principal or an alternative principal, if that could even be a thing, or some other thing that's not quite as high of a salary?
Okay. So some of these, we're looking at it, so if it was only putting back that assistant principal at the high school, I wouldn't be able to extend the middle level cyber program or those transition rooms that I detailed. So a lot of it is looking at it in a 6 to 12 fashion, more so than just a building. And it would be less efficient to hire specific, an additional leader for those programs in each building.
Okay.
I want to say, to complement what Laura just shared, we've had that very conversation in terms of looking at, and so we appreciate the question in terms of why not an assistant principal, and the other piece as well is, as you can see, hopefully from looking at the current programs, many of the programs that we currently offer, in many ways are sort of, they're supervised by a variety of individuals, all who do their very best job, but at the same time, they have many other responsibilities. And so particularly with our assistant principals at the high school, they are focusing on academic programs, student discipline, as well as any number of emergent type situations that might come up and require immediate attention. So oftentimes what then happens is some of these other programs aren't necessarily getting the full administrative leadership attention that we believe they need.
And so there was some mention that there could be money savings from for example, just the cyber program, if you were able to expand that, not having so many students going to cyber charters, for example, or having students go to other placements that are very expensive. But do we have any sense, or have we run any numbers in terms of whether this position could pay for itself?
So to explain exactly how that would happen, like by grace of some of our student placements, I couldn't do that specifically. What I can say is, again, in past experiences, that these programs, like if you look at, right now, we are spending $1.5 million on a cyber charter. If I could capture some of those middle-level students and have them in our own program, it cost me half the cost of the cyber charter tuition for regular ed and a third of the cost of the special education tuition for cyber charter. So cost avoidance is a tricky business where we don't make promises typically, but that's an example of how we are saving money versus having those students be in cyber. And those students are in cyber for various reasons, some of which could be athletic activity that is happening outside in their lives. Some of it could be for reasons of not being in school. But again, it's very purposeful. And I think if we extended it to middle level, we'd capture more students who wouldn't become part of another outside cyber charter and then not necessarily want to make the move back to us in ninth grade.
Okay.
So that's one example.
Okay. And I had other questions, but they're just this last one. Is there any thought to expanding the charter, the cyber program, not the charter program, so that it's more flexible? One thing that I've noticed is that it's hard to capture students who maybe only need to be in it for a little while, for example, or who only need to be in it for part of the day, but would be great to go to, for example, chorus or art or something that is it's offered in those programs, but it's clearly better to do in person.
Yeah, and that in essence would be when we talked about potentially expanding or offering blended learning opportunities for students. We would very much like to begin to do that. As you can appreciate, that would then first and foremost begin with conversations with our teachers to be sure that any blended learning opportunities that we're providing are absolutely aligned with the terms of the collective bargaining agreement. So there are some other preliminary steps that would need to happen first to help us achieve that vision.
Okay, that's interesting. Can I ask one more question? Yeah. It's sort of a statement. I just noticed with the internships that Jasper was mentioned, and I would just hope that it's not overemphasizing Jasper and underemphasizing all the other students who would be interested in something like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Other questions? Dr. Munson?
How does hiring a director of educational alternatives help us move to more restorative disciplinary practices and less punitive ones?
So the hope would be that someone would be able to lead and revision some of these programs. The current ISS and OSS that we have currently is a very traditional model that you may have experienced when you were in school or saw when you were in school. When we talk about, again, the ownership and revamping of these programs, we'd like it to be 6-12 cohesive, and also have somebody who's giving it the attention that we believe it needs in order for those programs to sustain themselves and for the programs that exist right now to improve.
So we just don't have anyone who has the time right now to make that transition?
Okay, so I'm going to give a comparison because I did a side-by-side comparison of like our administrative numbers next to Parkland. And Parkland, when you take us one for one, and I'll share that with you through another board report, we're shy about 10 administrators, which is about 400 man-hours a week. And so, again, I think we're doing a lot here to try to make improvements, and you're seeing our team grow, and we appreciate it greatly. But we do need, in order to allow the assistant principals to be the instructional leaders that we wish them to be in the classrooms, we also need to free them up from some of these responsibilities of trying to lead things part-time.
I mean, one of the things that I've heard from a number of different people that I've always been impressed with the district is that we have a restorative justice program here. Who runs that, and how is that successful without this position?
Yeah. So when I was here as an assistant principal in 2011, 2012, at that point, we made it a point to have all teachers trained in restorative practices. And that was through the Institute of Restorative Practices in Bethlehem local. The teachers were really the drivers of that initiative, and Mr. Peperato, who was formerly the high school principal, was a leader of that initiative. For me to state that I'm seeing restorative circles or those type of things occurring on a daily basis, at this point, I think it needs some leadership behind it to be able to sustain that type of like daily practice. And even specifically in specific rooms like ISS and OSS.
I wanted to follow up on, this is changing gears, but I wanted to follow up on the question about the high school assistant principals. I understand, right, that this is not, you envision this as broader than the high school, but in some of the materials that we were given in preparation for tonight, there was also reference to the staffing at the high school. So we used to have 6 and we now have 5 assistant principals, is that right?
Yes.
My understanding is that 4 of them are grade level principals, so their work is focused on the students in one particular grade, correct?
Yes.
So what is the portfolio of the 5th assistant principal?
The 5th is the assistant principal for academic affairs. One of that individual's primary responsibilities would then be the master schedule, facilitating course selection process.
Ad drop all year. So
Yeah.
there's things like, I'm just going to cite off the top of my head because I was looking into it, like the math ad drop and student requests. She works with a team of counselors and oversees the counselors to make sure there's consistency and fairness among, any of the student requests that are coming through our counseling office that have academic ramifications, along with the management of the department chairs. So she's responsible for a lot of the academic components in addition to the counseling components in that oversight.
And then I guess the last question I have about this position is one of the sort of rationales, as I have heard you describe it, and as you've written, is that these things are not done well as a part-time piece of sort of various administrators. But my question is, when I look at this list, this is a lot of different things, and I don't actually see the common denominator. They seem very, very different to me. In-school suspension and cyber learning and JASPER and internship programs, I mean, it seems to itself be cobbled together. So can you help me see this sort of common thread that makes this different than just what we're doing already? But
Sure. So if you really total up the students, if you take that column of the kids involved, when you look at a grade level assistant principal at the high school, we're talking around 740, 783 students. It's allowing me to also build a relationship between that director and a relationship of trust with the student and the families who are involved in these alternatives. So unfortunately, I have frequent flyers who are part of like in-school and out-of-school processes. If I don't have transition rooms, but if I did, that's a proactive way to keep them out of that more traditional discipline mode. And it's all, in some ways, in my mind, a continuum of how I can best serve these kids. Now, the internships are a little bit of a one-off, but again, I'm taking student population and looking at that. I'm like, who's going to be participating? And it's still going to approximate the load of a assistant principal.
so I wasn't actually questioning whether or not there was enough to
Okay.
do. I think that there's plenty of work to do.
Yeah.
My question was more that, and I'm not actually questioning any of the priorities that you have here. What I'm asking is, what is the common thread that makes this a position that
One
that you
position.
can
Okay.
define, right, rather than a position that's actually 5 positions that we just happen to give to one person?
So again, and I'm going to talk to logistics of some of the programs that we've seen. So in some ways, when the decision is made by certain districts to not have all of these programs on site or in the building, I've seen the model where they purchased elementary schools that are being closed in nearby school districts or other places that basically where there's space, and then they move those programs, especially some of those external placement programs, into those spaces. In terms of, what was your other one?
In terms of what is the common thread or the unifying theme for all these different programs, in essence, really, we were looking at, they are alternatives to what might be our traditional face-to-face learning opportunities that that many students at Emmaus High School will take. So the unifying theme is those students who, for any number of reasons, are not successful and or not choosing to remain in a traditional high school class or course.
Is there any concern that moving these items into the portfolio of a single person who's responsible for all of the kind of non-traditional education, that it has the effect of actually increasing the divide between our general ed and these, because the person in charge is not a person who has a foot in both? Or is that not something that is really?
I have not seen that in working with unless, again, everything that I've mentioned is externalized, which would not be the vision that we have for East Penn School District. I have not seen that they're typically involved, especially like if they're involved in transition programs, there's core teachers that they know that are pushing into the program, who they get to know very well. In terms of the internship program, again, like there are other people involved in these programs as well that we can repurpose who are currently in, like the 13 teachers that we use in the LTS program that might be utilized differently, again, with a different vision for some of these opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Levinson?
Hey, thank you. I'd actually like to follow up on a question that Ms. Bowman asked, which is one that I had, which related to the potential cost savings impact of this position. I do think this position is a little bit unique in that regard. Many of the other district priorities that are asked here, their deliverable is more on affecting student outcomes, compliance, or general operational efficiency. But this one does appear to have something to do with the bottom line. Personally, in my own experience, in working with industry, if you're, and making a new ask for a position, I would need to be a bit more specific as to what the potential, cost impact or cost savings would be. So I personally would like to see maybe it'd be a deeper dive into what we think the financial upside is to bringing somebody in to do this. I know it's very difficult to understand exactly what's going to happen, but I think, again, going to Ms. Bowman's point, understanding if there is a financial savings to be had with having someone in this position, not only for, paying this person's salary, but what else we can garner from it. What actually leads to my next point. Again, in overseeing all these multiple programs, both current and the future, I do see that there could be, there's the potential to want to develop and grow these programs, which means that there's going to be more people down the pipe to have these. So I think understanding the financial impact of having somebody in this position and create these kinds of efficiencies within that and bringing, and not having to pay for things outside the district, I think a much stronger understanding of what that could be would probably go a long way with me to gaining some more comfort in looking at this position. I don't know how the rest of the board feels about that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's any comment you can make at this point.
In the information that we provided with the board, for the board, with regard to the cost of some of those current programs, our intent there was really to provide the board with an overview of the cost, the current expenses that the district is allocating for some of this work. And I think the difficult piece, I absolutely understand the ask, meaning what you're requesting. I think the difficult piece becomes we see great potential in terms of going out to those students who currently are choosing a cyber charter option, not our own. We see great potential in continuing to do parent information sessions and really trying to recruit those individuals back. I think part of our goal is we wish for our program to be very strong and know that we can accommodate additional students and really help them to see success. And so it's just this fine line of never wanting to make a false promise that the position will completely be able to pay for itself in year one or year two. But certainly I appreciate your question, and we can go back and see if we can get a better sense of maybe the financial impact of the position, or if there are any other ways to communicate the potential cost savings.
Okay, I would appreciate that. But getting back to the second point, am I right in saying that in looking at these programs or directing these programs that there is a potential for more staffing in the future in order to I know we talked about these transition rooms, for instance. I mean, we're going to need somebody to
Be in them.
be in them. So,
In terms of what we would ideally like to do is maybe look at current staff who are in certain rooms, such as an in-school suspension room, and maybe look at using individuals differently. Do you have thoughts about
Well-
additional staff?
The other piece to this, that's, as the board knows, we currently have a use of time committee that's in progress at the high school. And so use of time greatly changes the way that we use staff. And so, again, that's something that could be considered in part of the vision of revamping these programs, is how we can use staff that we have currently more efficiently.
okay, thank you.
Mr. Champagne?
Yes, thank you very much. That was actually one of my questions. We have this use of time analysis going on, but we're asking for this position. I guess I would have thought before you went and asked for this position, you would have figured out, or at least put in front of the board, how you could reallocate the resources that you have to then help justify the need for something like this. Because what I'm concerned about is something that Dr. Levinson suggested, is kind of staff growth just because it's there. They're there, they look at it, and they're, people build kingdoms within organizations very easily. And I don't believe that's the intent, and I didn't think it would be the intent to do that, but it happens whether you want it to happen or not. And so I guess with some of these positions like this, I would have thought the use of time analysis to take a look at your current staff and say, how do we best utilize that group of individuals and reallocate that before we come and ask for new kind of leadership positions? So I guess I'm a little troubled by not having that piece of information to assess whether this is really a gotta have or a nice to have, or, where does it fall in that spectrum? And I know it's a priority, but it's at the bottom of the list. If I recall, you kind of ordered these priorities, and so it's near the bottom of the list. And I'm just concerned that, we're not taking advantage of the additional information that we're trying to generate before we ask for this.
So when you look at the cost of external placements that we had shared with the board, or you look at some of the other costs that are associated with using outside vendors, essentially, for servicing our students' need, the driver for this position is absolutely to service our students, and do it internally and do it more efficiently. And I can speak again to a personal experience, which I know I shared with you, in terms of, I've been part of a school district with a $65 million budget that furloughed 4 teachers that opted to keep this program because we knew the cost avoidance. And so perhaps putting you in touch with other school boards that have been down this road to see the outcomes and the sustaining outcomes over time. And that was during 2007, 2008, when those decisions were made. But the external placements, there is a great cost to that. And then I think I also shared with you the number of kids who experience going in and out of those placements in one calendar year more than one time. And again, without the transition rooms, it's sink or swim, so the costs sort of snowball. Not sort of, they do sometimes for certain students. And then in the same vein, I don't necessarily know that we meet their needs by saying, come back and take over your whole 9-period day schedule, and you'll be successful because you're back. So it is really about students, not necessarily, we weren't thinking about use of time was not the driver for the proposal for this position. It's simply, we also recognize this is an excellent time because of decisions that are being made at the high school of how we might reallocate staff if we look at different schedules. Is there anything else that you want to?
Well, I still would have thought that one of the drivers would be to figure out internally how to, you have a lot of people listed as people involved, and whether that is the optimal group of people or the right group of people, and how those resources within the district can be better utilized. If truly you're saying that there's a use of time, and I think of use of time not just with, as a broad look at all of the opportunities for how to reallocate resources. And so I guess that's where I'm still struggling with this, is have we really thought through all the people that are involved now, and are they being used in the most efficient way, or are there some ways to reallocate how they're in each of these in each of these programs, so that maybe this position isn't necessary? I mean, you've got a huge number of people involved in the VESPA and I would assume that they're all needed, but is it the optimal organizational structure to achieve what we're looking for? And I would have thought that kind of information would have been thought through or presented to us to kind of to support something like this.
Any other comments?
Oh, when you're done, can I ask a
Before we go,
follow-up?
okay,
Yeah.
before we go again. I sort of had a different take on this. I understand that the administration put in, there are possibilities for cost recovery, but I took from the presentation that here are things that we think we can improve student outcomes by offering that we can't offer now because we don't have the resources to do it. And so I would sort of view this as again, I don't know where we're going to land in the budget on what priorities we're going to get to, but I view this as the administration saying they looked at how can they offer these capabilities that they think we need to be offering and we don't offer now. And this is their solution to be able to offer it. And I think if we're looking at, we have the opportunity now to bring these people in, then you can look at a more direct cost savings in terms of, okay, we're paying this much for an external placement. We can hire a teacher and have 3 students internal instead of 3 external placements. I think that's the way you have a more direct cost savings analysis of hiring people for a specific task. I don't think this is perhaps not the right position in my mind to be trying to do the cost savings approach to justify, although there is anticipated to be some cost savings. Anyway, that's just my take. I don't know if you agree with the purpose, but my take was this isn't put on the priorities to be a pay-for-itself position. It's put on the priorities because they're education outcomes that we need, and this is what the administration thinks is the best way to achieve them.
Absolutely. It was on the priorities, if you go back to the vision for the position, because we believe there are programs that, again, amazing individuals are trying very hard to do good things in those programs, but we believe we can do them better. And if given additional resources to focus on those learning opportunities. And we also believe that there are additional opportunities that we can expand and offer to the students in East Penn. And tried to provide some, maybe a benchmark or a sense of where there might be some cost-saving opportunities. But ultimately, it really was about students driving our vision.
I also sense a change as we go along in how we budget. And I know when I first joined the board, basically the superintendent had already done all the trade-offs and basically said, here's what we need. I've already cut it down basically as low as I can get it, and there might be some cost savings. And I see this as especially in the first budget of having, a high tax increase and a lot of items unfunded. I don't know if we're going to fund everything in the budget, and it's a little less satisfying than, we gave the superintendent everything they asked for, but it may be the case that we don't get to the bottom priority because where we want to be on the tax increases and where the budget ends up. But I do appreciate seeing the view of what the leaders in the district believe the district needs to improve, even if we don't know how to pay for them this year. It's we haven't had that before in my time on the board so much, maybe one other time where we've said we need this, but we're putting it off into a future year. So that's my take. I know.
I guess I just wanted to give some background on why I was asking those questions then, because, I'm somewhat aware of the limitations of our current programs, and especially when you look at this number that we've only have 100 or so kids in the cyber program, but we have a lot more than that going off to cyber charters and not doing well in them. And also from talking to different parents and also from personal experience, one conversation with a mother will always, like, I'll never forget it, her saying that East Penn failed her son, and she meant it literally and figuratively, and that student is no longer in the district. And I'm convinced if we could expand this program, stories like that would be fewer. So I'm definitely a big believer in expanding alternative programming. And the reason I was asking the questions about could it possibly pay for itself is because I know we don't have the budget for it. So what I'm wondering, though, I understand you can't make a estimate, but what I'd love to see is how many students would we have to bring back for it to break even? Or to even approach, like, if we brought 10 students back, what would that look like? If we brought 25 back, what would that look like? Because that would, I think, help us to see, could this actually help the district overall be healthier? Losing students to charters is not a healthy thing for the district overall, and I think the next position probably that you're going to talk about gets into that as well. And then just as a side note, maybe I really don't want the answer now, but maybe for a summer meeting when we're really short, I would love a presentation about the in-school and out-of-school suspension and the models that, it sounds like you're moving towards another model, and I would love more of an understanding of what we're moving towards. It doesn't have to be tonight, it's just, it helps me to understand where things are coming from, so thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Byrd?
I have a couple of comments. Does this position have to be a director, a title, or can it be done by another leadership person? And also one other question, you have some priorities. What are your number 1 and 2 priorities for this position out the gate?
In terms of supervisory level of the position, as you can appreciate, we had a lot of problem solving with regard to where that position would fall. And so when we looked at the scope of responsibility, the various leadership positions that this individual in and of themselves would potentially be working with and supervising, that was the reason for really placing it at a director level position. And in terms of priorities, I believe that some of these could potentially be maybe low-hanging fruit and those that we might be able to address very early on. Like, for example, I think the first one that we have listed, in particular, the cyber, potentially recouping more students who are currently not with us but choosing to receive their cyber education from a different cyber charter school, as well as expanding those cyber opportunities to middle level. Because as Laura had described, that is something for several years now that we've had families who have asked if we offer such opportunities at the middle school. Laura, certainly if there are other immediate priorities that.
No, I'd say, yeah. I think, Dr. Bacher, I appreciated your words about having a vision for the future for the district of some of the programs and the development that we'd like to see. And I guess I can say, like, and I passionately shared this vision because as an assistant principal here in 2011, 2012, I experienced what our options were with students who were struggling with various things. And it was, and they were cutting class to go to in-school suspension because they didn't serve the detention, and then they would, move that progressive discipline. As an assistant principal, my use of time was to repeatedly meet with that student to sort of issue that progressive discipline per our discipline code. But I believe that we lacked some of the things that we need to be able to better serve these students based on my past experiences. So it is just a vision, and I understand.
Thank you.
Mr. Jankowski?
Thank you again for your explanation. It's been really helpful. To follow up on the request that Ms. Bowman and Dr. Levinson had asked, which is not by any means an easy task. I'm curious whether there really is a way to even estimate what potential savings are, because from the way I look at it, if a current student is in a cyber charter program, what's the likelihood that that student would come back? Because they left obviously for a reason. And you know, I have my opinions of the cyber programs. Obviously, we've all read about their effectiveness or ineffectiveness. So I'm wondering, not to make your task even harder, but when would there be cost savings? I guess really your target is to keep current students from leaving and going to a cyber charter program. Is there any way you can benchmark other schools that have done this to kind of just get a rough estimate of what type of success that they may have had in bringing students back versus keeping students in the future? And if so, when would we actually start seeing some of those cost savings that we could kind of use to pay for this position?
So I've had other districts share presentations that they've given their board in terms of developing a program. One of the tricks is you want to build something that's attractive enough to lure them back. So it's, again, like, is it an immediate year one, you see it all? I'd have to look into their data again and look at that, but I can definitely get my hands on those presentations and share that with the board as well.
Thanks.
I think there are some basic things that we know as well, and we've certainly, these are some of the things with which I think we might struggle somewhat in our current cyber program, in that we know that if students, obviously there is a reason that they're leaving our bricks and mortar school and choosing an online option. And if they were struggling here in a face-to-face classroom, many of those same students without supports and opportunities to check in with a teacher or a support system in some way, shape, or form, in the absence of that, they will likely have some of those same struggles. And so for us to really build those consistent touch points with students who are in a cyber program, I think is also very important. It's not here's your laptop, have a great year, as much as it is, again, really continuing and building that relationship.
And then that kind of goes to Mr. Champagne's point of, is that then create the need for additional resources if we're going to build something to compete with the cyber charters out there? Understanding that's only one of the, but I mean, it's on the top of the list, so I'm looking at it in that regard. And obviously, I'd like to keep all of our students within the walls or wires of Emmaus and East Penn. But again, I have the same concern of, is this just going to grow into further resources? Because you can never have enough, obviously. So, and that's more of a statement than a question. So, thank you.
Ms. Lynch?
I just want to say thank you for looking at alternative forms of education. I personally went to Emmaus High School and had a severe agoraphobia problem, and I needed a transition room when I was in 9th grade. So I desperately want you to find a way to let us pass this. Find a way to find that cost savings somewhere. Give us a reason to pass this, because I see potential here. And I think it's endless. Just recruiting, just putting out the awareness that we even have a cyber charter, I think would go far. Most folks don't realize that we have a cyber charter. Every parent that I've ever talked to about when they talk about going to cyber charters with their kids, and I said, well, did you check out the district one? They almost never know that there is a district one. So this position could easily, in my opinion, just easily pay for itself. So I hope you can show that in proof, so to speak, so we can do this.
Mr. Champagne?
Yeah, I guess I want to make sure, I don't have a problem with the alternative educational programs. I guess it's more about how we're going about trying to improve them. I mean, if we really think that the cyber charter program is like the linchpin to a lot of this, I would have thought there might be a way to go after that program within the existing set of resources to improve the opportunity set for kids that are thinking about cyber or trying to bring them back, versus necessarily having to hire someone to do that I know we're trying to grab a bunch of this stuff and put it under one individual to offload potentially, the burden on some of the other administrators. But if we are so concerned about this, if cyber is like the main hook here, is there another way to skin the cat to go after that, which helps address maybe one of the fundamental problems we're having, which is losing kids to other alternatives and not necessarily having to have this position?
Well, one of the things identified is we don't have a middle school cyber program, so if we don't
But I
create
understand
it.
that, but I guess, is there still a way within the current team to address the high school program as well as the middle school program? If we think cyber is so critical to the ability to help retain or bring back students, then I thought we would have attacked that without, not necessarily needing this new position to kind of pull everything together.
And Laura, I think Laura has something to share as well, but I just want to clarify. Mr. Byrd had asked the question about, is there, of these priorities, is there a starting point or one that you feel is the most logical place to begin? And so I had mentioned the cyber, and so then there was a lot of discussion about cyber. I certainly don't want to, I just want to clarify that the Director of Educational Alternatives position was not envisioned so that we can just provide better cyber and blended learning opportunities for students. That is one example of several educational opportunities that we'd like to improve. And to answer your question in terms of, we really for several years now have looked at our cyber model and the individuals that we have working as part of that program. We went from having a single assistant principal to sharing that responsibility to 2 individuals. We went from having 1 instructional coach work with them to maybe 2 instructional coaches. How many counselors? Like we have tried multiple models, and I think to Laura's point, just continue to struggle because in terms of the leadership support, our leaders who are involved in those programs really are consumed with other responsibilities as well.
No, that's what I was going to say.
All right, I guess I'll just throw that, from my industry experience, if it's that critical, you put somebody in charge, and you offload and put his or her other responsibilities onto someone else. I mean, so I guess there's...
That's what this position is.
Yeah, but without this position. I mean, sometimes you make internal decisions about, okay, this is a very high priority, and I'm going to allocate the resources I have to this versus that, and you offload the individuals who, who are involved in other things.
Assuming it's higher priority than what they're doing now.
Yes, exactly. You don't necessarily need to add staff to necessarily do that. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
I totally understand, and I'm going to say what I'm about to say completely respectfully. But the C&I supervisor who's in charge of cyber is Mike Mahalik, who's in charge of science and math, who's in charge of multiple other things that are going on currently. The 2 high school principals are both grade level principals. So they are accommodating 750 students and families and their needs, and also supervising at least 1 department, but typically 2 or more. And then some of them have our staff assistants or other groups, bargaining groups. Then I have the 9 high school counselors who all have a load of students. That's about equal at this point. And then the 3 administrative assistants, we again tried to piece things out. And this has been an evolution since I came here in 2015. And then we have the 1 technology coach who's kind of providing that onboarding and the technical support and meeting with students and families. And we have days in here where she comes in and brings in families. But then she has the job of also doing all the K-5 iPad coaching and working with teachers. So it's really hard to reassign, to pluck somebody out of one of those roles to lead this. Does that make sense?
I agree with you that
Okay.
it sounds very difficult, but that doesn't mean that they're the only people that could lead this. What I'm trying to find out is there an individual who has a passion for this within the organization? He or she may be a teacher, maybe some other individual that would love the opportunity to take this on and grow it. Because that's how when I worked in industry, you found those people. They may not be the quote leaders that you have as an assistant principal or someone else, but someone who really wants to take this and drive it and make it happen.
I would say in my 8 years on the board, I would say the first 6 of those years, we were cutting to try to meet, maybe first 5 of them, we were cutting to try to meet budgetary constraints. And so when I remember several years ago looking at comparisons of our administrative overhead as a function of our budget versus other districts, and we are very lean on that. I think when I looked at it last, it was something like 4.8% of budget. So, I mean, by your logic, you would never have to hire another administrator ever, because you could always reassign people and have them.
No, I'm
And
not-
I don't know the answer, but
Kate, you know I'm not arguing that.
I know.
What I'm saying is that if this program, though, is so important, then you find individuals within an organization that want to champion it. That doesn't mean you have to hire administrators to do that. You can find individuals who will take the responsibility and will grow to lead a program, and you can backfill that with maybe somebody else who is not necessarily an administrator.
I'm not arguing because I don't know the background. I'm just saying, the assumption that that hasn't been looked at is what I'm really taken out
It
of.
hasn't.
So that's where I was with that. Are there any other comments or questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next position is also an administrative position, and this position, we're referring to it as an inclusion specialist, and as I articulated at the beginning of the presentation, we envision that this particular position would be supervisory in nature, again, giving the scope of responsibilities, as well as individuals with whom they would be supervising and interacting. And so the vision for the inclusion specialist, I'm going to take you back to a couple meetings where we provided an overview of or a high-level overview of inclusion. Particularly, that conversation was in the context of special education and the need for additional staffing there, and our belief first and foremost in terms of the educational learning opportunities that we wanted to provide for special education students. In particular, we desire for those special education students to be included in the regular education classroom to the greatest extent that's appropriate. And we know that there are certainly many cases, we gave you some statistics at the elementary level, we know that there are many cases in which students who are currently being pulled out and receiving their education almost exclusively in a special education classroom, that they could appropriately be supported in a regular education classroom. And so our vision for the inclusion specialist is that we will support the inclusion of all students in regular education classrooms, in particular through collaborative consultation with education professionals. So this is an individual who would collaborate with regular ed and special education teachers, as well as we've talked a lot about our support staff being very important to the educational process, and our families. So when we think about priorities for this particular position, a significant priority would be just that, in terms of professional development for those groups that we just mentioned, teachers, support staff, administrators as well, on inclusive practices for instruction and behavior. And when we talk about inclusive practices, we really are talking about classroom strategies, instructional practices that regular as well as special education teachers will employ so that all students can be successful in a regular education setting. So this is not simply taking special education students and putting them in a regular education class and crossing our fingers and hope that they're successful, but being really intentional with those instructional practices that we know are critical to student success in a classroom. In addition to the professional development, this individual, again, would work closely with our school-level teams and administrators to develop accommodations or modifications that we know need to happen to the regular ed curriculum so that those students can be successful in a regular education classroom. And then working very closely with our teams as well as teachers in actually adapting or changing their methods and assignments to meet the needs of special education students. And then we also mentioned here this piece. You might recall we've talked in previous presentations as well about a priority of a behavior support position, specifically to work with our students who have identified behavioral needs. So this particular position, again, would also work closely with our behavioral specialist to provide behavioral strategies for, to IEP teams, specifically for those students who have an identified behavioral need as part of their IEP. So high-level overview, this position would certainly, I think you heard the word collaboration there a whole lot. Coaching-like, working very closely with teachers, support staff, in terms of identifying strategies that will help students to be successful in classrooms. Another key component of this is professional development. And we recognize that ongoing professional development really is critical ultimately for any instructional change. And so when we look then at our current leadership structure in the area of special ed, our attempt here, and Dr. Bacaric is going to come up in just a minute to give you an overview of the leaders that we currently have in our special ed department, in essence, in an attempt to answer the question of, sort of to Mr. Champagne's question a minute ago about the other position. Can we not look from within and perhaps identify individuals currently in the organization who might be able to lead some of this work? So our goal is to really point out the scope of responsibilities of the other 3 supervisors as part of our special ed team.
Hi, good evening. So as Kristen mentioned, we have 3 supervisors in our special ed department, and currently they supervise per level. So we have an elementary, middle level, and a high school supervisor. You can see that they supervise the special ed programs within the buildings. Elementary has 7 buildings. The middle level has 2, and then we have 1 high school. And along with that supervision of programs and staff, you'll see that they also handle the outside placements for the students that are placed out of district. And so there are a variety of programs, both emotional support, life skills, multiple disabilities, and then we have other students placed in placements that are like court ordered. So they are responsible for all of that. If you look at the breakdown of the students, if you total things up, the elementary has 497 students total, middle level 406, and the high school 458. And so one of the goals and one of my visions is to really restructure the special ed supervision. And so what I would like to do is I would like to have a K-8 supervisor for each middle school. And so the middle level and their feeder schools would have a K-8 supervisor. And this way there would be a continuum of service. The supervisor would know the students as they move through K-8. The other thing that I want to mention is, as you know, we would love to increase our LRE. We're on corrective action. Right now, we have some inclusion that is new in regards to math inclusion this year, and so that's at the elementary level. And the elementary supervisor is trying to work with those teams, and so it's been effective somewhat, but due to her caseload, she doesn't have a lot of time to spend with the teachers. So we really feel as though this position would support our vision for more inclusive practices for special education, as well as going into the classrooms and supporting students that are in the MTSS framework and putting supports in place for them with the hopes of that they wouldn't be identified if we, had additional behavior or academic supports. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Mr. Jankowski?
It appears as, well, thank you first.
You're welcome.
It appears as though a good portion of the priorities for this position is development, both professional, curriculum, as well as, putting programs in place. Is this something that requires a full-time position, or is this something where we can use an outside service as an initial stepping stone to kind of help put in place some different programs to kind of give the guidance or initially set forth some development, programs for the teachers, or help us structure the curriculum in a manner that the teachers can learn through this training, and therefore, with the staff we have today, kind of start the motions with this, with the different types of developments and programs that you're looking for from this position.
So to answer your question, if you recall, in a past school board meeting, I had mentioned that we went to full inclusion at the middle level with regard to math. And so at that point in time, we did bring in the IU to support us, and so they did training over the summer. And with that said, it is kind of a once and done training, and so it's really the sustainability of that. So to have that person, when someone is having difficulty making those accommodations or modifications, or we have, significant behaviors, and I know we're asking for a behaviorist as well, but really it is kind of that core team coming together and providing all of that support. So yes, we have used the IU, and again, they're not available all the time, so it's scheduling the training, and we do have other training priorities as well in the district, so that is kind of difficult to coordinate.
But even having someone come in and kind of look at what we're doing today and offer suggestions on what we can do to maybe restructure how our programs are. I mean, and again, I'm looking in light of, the costs of all these priorities. Are there ways that we can at least initially address a part of what we're trying to accomplish here, but at a much less cost for the foreseeable current
Sure,
future?
sure. Yes, I mean, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and yes, we could use the IU. They are a resource to us.
Are they the only resource that we could use for this?
To my knowledge, yes. So we have never used anyone else. The IU is a free resource, so that would really be our go-to. And they have support staff that do training for districts.
Other questions or comments? Ms. Bowman?
I didn't realize the IU we're paying something for that, right? Or
It's all built into the cost, so yes.
so that wouldn't change if this person came, even though we'd be leaning on them less, the price tag would remain the same?
That is
correct?
accurate, yes.
Okay. Forgive me for this question. I'm
No,
not
go
really
ahead.
sure
I'm sorry,
exactly how
that's just for the training component. The students that we send to the IU, we
Okay.
pay
per student.
per student.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I
Go ahead,
also,
sure.
no, I just wanted to clarify the IU piece as well. When we talked about the training, I believe that was a very focused training in a consolidated block of time. And so it was several days over a summer. And then the teachers, again, went and implemented the strategies. And so it was not necessarily ongoing professional development. The other piece that I'll say is, the IU offers great services for our special education programs, and a portion of that is professional development. There are also quite a few outside consultants who certainly come in and provide work for districts at a cost with regard to looking at inclusion plans. So I just wanted to mention that piece.
Oh, okay. I think given the budgetary cycle that we're in, it would be interesting to see what those alternatives are. I'm not even sure if that has to come to board level if it's IU, because there's no cost associated with it, but especially if it's something that we can outsource, so at least there's a savings to benefits and things like that. Forgive me for this question. I feel like it's going to just display how much I don't know, but how much does class size come into the problem that we're having? I don't know if we could hire 2 special education teachers for this one position, but like, if we had fewer students in each class, would this still be an issue that we'd have to address?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, thank you again for the presentation. I'm kind of looking at the two positions that have been presented tonight, and for me, this is the one that stands out. I guess I don't really necessarily have a question, but a little perspective I wanted to share. So if you have comments you wanted to put out there, that's great. The reason why this one kind of stands out to me goes back to a couple weeks ago when you shared just how far off our least restrictive environment, the numbers in which we're satisfying those requirements are, so how far off where their expectation is, and our lack of compliance in that area. And then on top of that, the shifting goalposts from the state, where that benchmark is constantly being changed. So I think that with that in the back of our minds, the form of inclusion that we're looking to bring into our classrooms, I think there's a lot of education on the part of the board, of the community, of everybody, to understand just what inclusion, our vision of inclusion looks like. And I think that if we can do that, it makes the importance of this particular position a little bit larger. I think there's a lot of misconception out there, or rightfully so, not right. I don't know if it's right or not, but of the fact that inclusion, it's taking kids that have special needs, behavior, academic, otherwise, and making a small group within the broader context of a classroom. When it's more than that. It's a seamless mixture of kids with special needs and kids that don't have special needs, and it's not, okay, look at that table over there, those are the kids that have that need. It's a more holistic, heterogeneous grouping of that, and to move towards that model requires a lot of training, expertise, professional development that goes beyond the special educators that are in front of that critical population of learners in our classroom. And so those folks, they know what inclusion is, they know what it should look like, but their caseloads are so high that their primary focus is the faces of the kids that are in front of them and their individual needs. But then the other piece of inclusion is that it needs to be not just, okay, I'm the classroom teacher, this is the other adult working with those kids. It needs to be a collaborative model. That's something we've heard a lot of today as well. But that collaborative piece doesn't really happen when you're just the adult bringing in a small group of kids into a classroom and then teaching them the material that the other teacher is kind of presenting to everybody else. And so it goes far beyond that. And we need, we can debate the level of importance of this, but there needs to be somebody that can build those bridges, build in that collaboration, so that it's not, there's no resentment on the part of the classroom teacher saying, I've got these 25 kids that need me, and those are my focus, and now there's a half dozen other kids that are coming in that somebody else is telling me I also need my focus, but I need to be responsible for both of those. And those 25 regular ed kids, I've got that covered, that's in my wheelhouse, but what are we doing, what can I do for those other 6 kids? And we don't want it to become somebody else's problem. If you're an adult in a room and you have kids in front of you that are, you're responsible for making sure that they're making the goals that need to be made, whether your title is the regular classroom teacher, or your title is emotional support teacher, or whatever your title is, that becomes a responsibility. And so building those connections and building those bridges and turning what we know of as the best practices of inclusion into something that is meaningful for all kids, not just our special education students, requires a level of coordination that we simply do not have currently because of the challenges and the limitations that we have with the staff that we currently have. So that's just how my perspective on what I see and what I'm hearing from Dr. McCarrick. So there's not, like I said, there's not really a question there, but that's just some of the perspective that I'm seeing.
And I appreciate your comments and your thoughtfulness, in your explanation. And as I said previously, we're most problematic with the LRE at the elementary level. And so that is where we have a lot of work that needs to be done. And so at the elementary level, really, there has been no education with regard to inclusion that's been formalized. And so we really feel as though in order to increase our inclusive practices, that this position is really warranted. We have our subcommittee meetings at the elementary, middle, and high school level, and this has been a theme in the committees, and the committees are made up of special ed teachers, regular ed teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, school psychologists. So we have a lot of people involved in, examining the data for students and trying to develop a plan moving forward to include students. So I can honestly say that this has been, a real need that has been derived from those committees.
Dr. Munson.
Yeah, so I've spoken to a lot of people in the district about special education over the last month. Special ed teachers, regular ed teachers, parents of special ed kids, one janitor, IAs, a lot of people. I feel like it's been a third job. And one of the things that sort of comes out of that, number one, is the depth of the need that the district has for addressing special education. But another is some of what you have shared here, which is, that we have a bifurcated system in which we have regular education teachers who do not have either the skill set or the resources that they need to work on this inclusion. But that all brings me back to actually where this discussion started. It seems to me that education and training are really important here. And $144,000 a year buys us a lot of training that doesn't require an administrative position. And it is sustainable over a number of years. And I guess I'm still having a hard time understanding what a management position like this would be doing sort of day to day that wasn't training. And if it's training, it seems to me that there are more cost-effective ways to do this, and not just cost-effective, maybe more effective in general, because it means we can get specialized people who have specialties, in elementary ed or in a particular class of special education needs and things like that. I mean, I guess I'm still missing the vision part for how a permanent or semi-permanent administrative position is the best way to solve the very problems that you've outlined that we have.
So I think, again, it's about sustaining the inclusive practices. And so for me, we can do all the training in the world, but if you don't have the people in supervisory positions to support those teams, it's not going to work very well. And so I think, right now, the position that we're in, if you look at the workload for the supervisors, we just don't have the capacity for, people to go into the classrooms and sit for 3 hours and work with the team and look at materials and talk about how we can restructure the lesson and restructure the assessments. So that's, one piece of it. And the other piece of my vision is, and I didn't really talk about this a lot, is if you look at the supervisors and they're doing all of the outside placements, to possibly have this person work with that emotional support population as well to help restructure their materials so that we're not placing students out of district. So working with the behavioral therapist and maybe supervising those programs. So ultimately that that is something that is weighing heavily in the back of my mind.
So would this position itself be a supervisory position for the, for the special ed supervisors?
Correct, yes. So it would be in addition to, it would be a special ed supervisor position.
But
So are you saying, you're asking, would they report to them, or would it be a?
No, they
peer
would not be,
to
this position would not be supervising the supervisors. It would be,
A peer?
I'd have 4 supervisors.
okay, but the idea, I mean, you said something about restructuring, and it wasn't clear to me what you meant by that. My understanding of what you said was that your plan was to restructure the elementary and middle supervisors so that we're 2K through, instead of elementary and middle, it would be just 2K through 8.
Correct.
So presumably one would be LMMS and one would be IRE and then the feeder school.
Yes.
To those.
That's the,
Okay.
and it kind of equals out the student caseload, so to speak. So, just looking at the numbers, it would go from elementary 497 to 467.
Okay.
So it's not like that great of a difference, but it's a difference.
Fair enough. So, to me, the structure that's listed up here it's very clear to me how that works. And the structure of K through 8 and a high school person, also very clear to me how that works. When you add this 4th person who has this different title, it's not clear to me how they work together. Right? Like, now, where does responsibility lie, in IRE middle school, when they are dealing with these IEPs that, that include least restrictive environment provisions? Is it the inclusion specialist? Or is it the other supervisor? Or does it end up being both? In which case, now we're pulling both of them into the meetings, which means now we haven't actually reduced anyone's caseload. We've just increased the number of administrators that are at every one of these meetings.
So to answer your question, the level supervisor would still be in charge of going to the IEP meetings. And so if something is articulated at that meeting where they need the support for the inclusion specialist, they would then be assigned to that staff to support them.
So the idea would be that the inclusion specialist would have a caseload that was some subset of the caseloads of all of these 3 other supervisors?
Could look at it that way, yes.
Well, I mean, I'm asking how you're looking at it.
Yes.
And would that then relieve the original case manager of that caseload? Or are they now going to are both of these supervisors going to have that particular set of students on their case rolls?
Well, I look at the inclusion specialist as supporting teams. So in other words, at an IEP meeting, you have the entire school team. So it's made up of, the regular ed teacher, the special ed teacher, parents, et cetera. And so if something is, again, articulated where they're having an issue with this student where they feel as though they need a change in placement, they can't support the student, they should be in a pull-out program, that inclusion specialist would then be assigned to say, go in and work with this team and analyze the data, see what's going on, see what we can do to support that student. Right now, the supervisor is trying to do that, but as I said, with the workload, it's really not that effective. So they don't have the time to really sit, and they support them as best they can, but it's not that specialist who is kind of skilled in working with teams, and that would be one of the qualities that we would look for, someone that has, knowledge with regard to inclusive practices and all of that.
Do our current supervisors have knowledge of inclusive practices?
They do, yes. Are they experts? No.
Okay. And how would the inclusion specialist come up to speed on all of the sort of intricacies of the case that they're being given? I mean,
So I have supervisor meetings weekly on a Friday from 1 to 4. And so that's when our team debriefs, we talk about students. That would continue, and that would be one of the mechanisms to bring the person up to speed.
Is this position equivalent in salary and qualifications with the other three supervisors?
It would be, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
you're welcome.
Other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback as always. And now Mr. Saul will move into the long-range plan.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the long-range plan to you this evening. The long-range fiscal and capital plan offers a look at past, present, and future finances of the district and is intended to aid us with planning for the future. The plan underwent a significant renovation or overhaul this winter, and I hope you're as excited about the changes that you see as I am to present them to you. This evening, I would like to offer you an overview, so we'll just go through the plan at a very high level, but more importantly, I'd like to answer any questions you have that you may have thought of as you were reviewing the plan. So on the cover, you see, I have to give a quick shout out. You see, we've rebranded the district, so we had to put the brand on the cover of the long-range plan. So there it is. Again, table of contents. The introduction is, again, just that. Provides a little bit of information about the plan, the purpose of the plan, and just a couple things to keep in mind. The plan is designed to help us understand the long-range impact of the financial actions that we take during the current fiscal period. But we want to remember that the plan is a dynamic plan, and it changes. It uses certain assumptions that may or may not come true. And so, while we want to use it as a planning tool, we need to remember that it's not an absolute fiscal plan, especially the farther out into the future you go. It does include finances from both our general fund and capital reserve fund, which are the two most significant funds that we have in the district. Next, in the overview, again, very high level, highlights the goals and offers factors to consider as you're reviewing the plan. And then on page 3, I wanted to touch on the data that's actually used in this plan, specifically the 2019-20 estimates are management's estimates of the end of the year figures that was updated just in time to go in the plan. So those are current estimates. And then the 2020-21 proposed budget figures remain the budget figures from the from the preliminary budget that the board viewed previously. And I thought it would just be clearer to include those numbers so you could look at the plan and digest the plan as a plan. And then we will, I'll come back next time and give you updated budget numbers so that we can look at those separately and independently of sort of trying to get used to looking at the plan. So I will take a few minutes on the first page on the summary to sort of talk about how it's laid out. Many of the sections are laid out similarly. The plan, the update to the plan is that we now have 5 years of actual fiscal data, which is then followed by the budget and the budget estimate for the current year. And then it continues on the next page, again repeating the budget and budget estimate, so you can see that laid out. Then it has the next year proposed and then 4 years of projected. So essentially, if you consider the proposed and the projected, you have a 5-year projection in the future, you have 5 years of history in the past and the current year. I did poll a few people in terms of layout. There was one request to try to fit all that on one page. I can say that when it goes on one page, I can't read it. So it became more efficient to lay it out over 2 pages. Sometimes it is easier to see if you can look all the way across. But again, for sort of making it usable in terms of size, we broke it up over 2 pages. If you work down across this page, the summary, you can see, again, high-level summary that summarizes many of the other sections of the plan. In terms of revenue, you have your local, state, and federal revenues. The district priority revenues, I'll just touch on real quick now. In some of the priorities, they are salaries and benefits. They include salaries and benefits. Recall that the state provides reimbursement on FICA and retirement, 50% reimbursement. So on some of those, there's actually an income component, and so that's broken out so that you can see that income piece when there are actually priorities plugged into the budget. And then in terms of the expenditures, again, salaries and benefits are broken out. You have district-wide instructional services, non-instructional services. The priorities would be broken out. Our transfer to capital reserve fund and debt service. I went over those individually because it's slightly different from the way you might otherwise see our budget represented. The Pennsylvania Department of Education has a prescribed format, which you see in our budget book, which really sort of lumps things by functional category, where here we're doing it more by, again, salaries, benefits, and how it's related to instruction. And then we've talked about the concept in the past of backing out the budgetary reserve because it's a line item which is budgeted, but not necessarily intended to be spent. It's there for unforeseen, so we back that out in order to get our anticipated expenditures. And then we look at a comparison of our revenues to expenditures and where that leaves us. So you could see in 2014-15, there was actually a spend down of fund balance of 1.9 million. Next year, you can see there was a spend down, and then you see that turned, and there was contribution to the fund balance, or the fund balance grew. Below, then, we look at the fund balance in terms of a percentage of anticipated expenditures and a percentage of total expenditures. A new metric that was added for this year is fund balance as a number of months of anticipated expenditures. Again, just another benchmark to look at to see how that fund balance is growing or shrinking with, in terms of a number of months. A number of months can be important. We talk about this a little later in the plan because a number of the fiscal benchmarks is that you should have two months of operating backup, if you will. Now, what you want to keep in mind is this is just our general fund balance, and when the fiscal, like the rating agencies look at our district, they'll combine our capital reserve balance with that to say, okay, you have total reserves of X. So again, this is just another benchmark to help you look at that. Again, the second page just shows you current year and projected out. That's page 6. And then page 7, the assumptions. This is the one section I do want to take some time to go over in a little bit of detail, only because, in any plan where you're projecting the future, sort of the important part of the plan is the projections that you're using. So I'm just going to go down through these and talk about them a little bit. When we talk about assessment growth, again, that's the growth of assessed value of properties in our district. That might be through additional development or, people putting on additions to their house, a new warehouse, if you will. And so this becomes very difficult. You can look at the trend over the past, but we're all sort of familiar with the footprint of the school district and know that there has been significant development, but we also know that there is decreasing amount of land. There's also efforts for preservation of land. So you can conclude that spiked growth is not going to continue, I would think, far into the future. So in terms of projecting into the future, we've actually used these numbers for a number of years, the 1%, 0.9, 0.8. Again, just sort of, I guess it's a little conservative, estimating that at some point there's going to be a turn and you're going to see sort of a reduction in the growth of our real property in terms of assessment. The next item is interim real estate taxes. Again, these are taxes that are levied on a property that might be finished in between the tax billings. So we have a July 1 tax billing. Property is developed It's approved for occupancy in December, and so there's actually a value of an increased value of that property between December and the next tax billing, July 1, that needs to be billed. And so that's what the interim assessments are. Well, again, with the significant growth we've had of warehouses and various things over the last several years, it really skews the numbers. And if you look, you can see some, spikes of 59% and some dips of 36%. So generally, I believe that that's somewhat unreliable when you have those swings. And I think generally, if you look at interim real estate, we're trying to find that middle of the road line. And so the 0% doesn't contemplate we're not going to get it, but just contemplates that there wouldn't be increase or decrease over years. Same concept with real estate transfer tax. We see a spike there of 45%. What we've seen in the district is we have some really big industrial or commercial industrial properties that will change hands. And when they change hands, you see all of a sudden this spike. In fact, we have one that's pending, Liberty property that has the warehouses out in Congdon Hill in the Albertus area, has sold them to someone else. And so there's the potential for another spike this year. Unfortunately, after calling the state and the county, and nobody can really tell me how much it is, we can sort of estimate and we think we know what it's going to be. But everybody has told me until they actually file their paperwork, we won't know. So I hesitate in putting that number into the budget anywhere, just as an aside, until we actually see what that number is going to be. So that could be a pleasant surprise, I'll warn you, at some point. Remember, that's one-time money, though, when it does come in. Earned income tax, earned income tax is a wage tax, so we generally, again, I'm trying to look for a center line, if you will, and base that annual increase. So some years you might have a little more, some years you might have less, but sort of generally speaking, we're expecting 2% growth. I guess with what's happened over the last few weeks, maybe we want to revise that. But I think long term, again, we're trying to find a center line long term. So 2% seems reasonable. We'll continue to watch the economy, I guess. Delinquent taxes. If you notice, the delinquent tax numbers mirror the assessment growth. What I have found over many years of watching tax revenues is that those people who pay their taxes in the discount period right up front do it every year. Those people who pay at the end of what we call the face period at the levy amount, they pay the same place every year, and those people who go delinquent are consistently delinquent every year. And so really what that growth number, it just mirrors the assessment growth, saying, okay, well, as our property value grows, we're going to see sort of the same growth in our delinquencies. IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, again, it's based on the federal government and the amount of money that they allocate through the state to the IU, and then it's distributed on a formula to the district. So about the best we can do is look at the average over the past several years and project that average forward. Investment income, we've had some fantastic years the past few years in terms of investment income, $600,000 or $700,000. Unfortunately, with the Fed rate cut over the last few days, we're actually looking at the current year as well as next year, and potentially going to revise down our estimates. So again, the zero doesn't represent 0% interest. It represents, once we find a number, it's a number we'll stick with that will be conservative moving out into the future. Basic ed subsidy, again, looking at the past, projecting the future. It feels a little high to me, but the past, I'm used to budgeting like a flat 2.5%, because traditionally that's what the state did. The General Assembly would say, okay, hold harmless 2.5% next year. However, over the past few years, all of the new money has been passed through the funding formula, so it's not quite as predictable. If it's 2.5%, we might get more, we might get less based on local factors. So if you combine the basic ed and the special ed, it averages out to 3%, which I think is a reasonable number overall to project forward into the future. The transportation subsidy, you may recall that we approved last year a new contract with our transportation provider. This is the first year. That calls for a 3% increase each year. So I've plugged in and projected a 3% increase in our subsidy each year. Again, there are some other factors that go into that, like your local market value aid ratio, which is a measure of local wealth. But as sort of a number that we can grab a hold of and plug in, 3% seems reasonable. And then the Ready to Learn grant, again, it has been in place for a number of years, but there hasn't been growth in that, and so we're projecting 0. So in terms of our revenues, they're the significant revenue projections. In terms of our expenses, the district-wide instruction, you can see that 6.8, and it's like, okay, well, on average, we're at 11. In my opinion, that 24% in going from 17-18 to 18-19 was a bit of an anomaly. Probably due to any number of factors. So I averaged 14 through 18, and then when you average 14 through 18, you come up with 6.8%. Again, intuitively feels like a better number, a closer number on average. And then the next charter school costs, again, there's a 14% in there that seemed like a significant spike, especially when you look at where we were trending, in previous plans. So I used 15 through 19, and you come up with roughly 3.6% in terms of charter school costs, which again ties back to what we have seen in previous plans. The next several items, LCTI tuition, again, it's sort of looking at the history. They're relatively consistent in terms, as you can see, in terms of the increases, so projecting that forward seems reasonable. And then community college tuition, you may recall that Mrs. Thompson was here and discussed with us a little bit about, there have been very small decreases. I would say overall, it isn't significant enough we don't know what can happen in the future, so a 0% seems very reasonable rather than something that may be negative. Transportation cost, again, I talked about the contract and the 3% increases over the next several years. The one thing that wouldn't consider is if we had to add maybe an additional route. One thing we actually need to look at in the current year wouldn't affect the 3% projection, but one thing we'll want to look at is if we actually approve a school calendar that has one less day, that has a $48,000 impact on transportation. So the calendar that is teed up for approval, if approved, we actually would be able to decrease our transportation expense for next year. So a great place to find money. Kudos.
We could get rid of half the days and save all kinds of money.
It would be a significant savings. To be very honest with you, when you talk to someone in the community and you ask them if they know how much it costs for transportation for a day, and you say $48,000, it is literally mind-blowing. I mean, people's eyes, jaws drop and eyes pop out. So try it sometime. And then in terms of district priorities, again, 3.5% has sort of been the gold standard over the last several years in our plans. That's what we've stuck with. And then finally, budgetary reserve. You don't see budgetary reserve listed under the actual because budgetary reserve is just that it's a budgetary number and it doesn't exist in actuals, because when you close out your budget and go to actuals, it no longer exists. And so what we have done is used a 5% benchmark over the last several years. Again, it would always be up for debate whether that's a reasonable number, but we have other benchmarks later that you can look at, and it seems to be okay. I want to stop there, actually, and see if there are any questions. Again, I feel like this is the sort of the heart, if you will, of the plan, because everything else tends to stem off of this, or even anything that I discussed before this part of the.
Mr. Champagne?
Yes, thank you. This is very helpful. I love getting this.
He enjoys it as much as you enjoyed making it.
Good.
So if I understand it correctly, the fund balance, the projections have increased by about $613,000. Is that accurate?
Let me just flip back. Are we on?
Page
Page 4.
Yeah.
11. The number you said again was?
613. That sound about right?
Are you, from 2014-15 to?
No, I'm talking about what you had projected in January to what you're projecting now. You're showing an increase in the fund balance of about $600,000. So the fund balance.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, that wasn't clear enough. Okay. And then I guess in the estimated numbers for 1920, we had, I remember through a couple of approvals, the board had given you the authority to dip into the budgetary reserve. Are those reflected in the 1920 estimate now? Or-
Yes.
So is the budgetary reserve going down, or have you found savings to offset those?
Those other expenses have been funded through savings.
Okay.
And we have not
still have the full
used.
amount of budgetary reserve that was in the original budget?
Yes. However, the 1920 estimate does not include budgetary reserve at this point, because we're trying to accurately estimate where we would end the year.
Okay. But you've accounted for those costs, and you're not dipping into?
Yes, sir.
And then, one thing I was, on the assumptions page, we mentioned it before, but are the capital expenditures, have they been inflated? And if they have been, what assumption are you using to inflate those expenditures?
Yes, and can we save that question until we get to the capital section? Because if there's another question, I'm actually going to ask Mr. Anushko if he can address that, because he did the inflation.
It would just be
But-
helpful if, when you, in your assumption sheet, if there is an inflation factor you're using, if you would put it down there.
Sure.
So that we have a sense of, and then maybe look at how actuals on some of the expenditures have gone versus budget, so we get a sense on, okay, are we being too conservative or not? You know, because capital numbers move all over the place, and it would be helpful to understand that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate any constructive comments like that, because this is your plan at the end of the day, and we want it to be helpful, so thank you. Dr. Bacher, I'll take any other questions
Okay.
from the board.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, a couple of quick things. First, just a request. When you're going through some of the different categories, if you wouldn't mind just letting us know what line it is you're specifically referring to.
Yes.
There's a lot of things I'm like, wait, and by the time I catch up, you're already kind of on to the next thing. The other two things, you had flagged a couple of things, and I apologize if this is getting too into the weeds, but you brought it up, so it's your fault. No,
Sure.
There's some speculation on line 25 of the instruction spike to 24%. I'm just speculating.
You on?
Page 7. So yeah, I messed up my own feedback there. That one spike of the 24% increase in instruction, that kind of tied into the same time when we did the technology rollout. So kind of a two-part question. Where is the technology built into this? And now that we're through the first three phases, first of all, is that part of that spike? And second of all, where would future rollouts of refreshes and updates and those types of things, where would they appear on this, or would they appear somewhere else?
Yeah, so in terms of the first part of your question, they very likely could be part of that spike. If I remember correctly, is that when we also put full-day kindergarten into place?
Oh.
You may recall that we had some, like, this would not include the salary and benefits, but we had some expenses in terms of purchasing classroom materials and furniture for classrooms. So there were some additional expenditures in that year in addition to the technology. The technology plan, for the most part, is built in a way that it's self-sustaining, so that the annual cost is similar each year. So it's built into the budget now. So what we tried to do is prevent like spikes and decreases, so that when we look at the rollout of devices, the Apple devices are on leases. So we want those leases to follow themselves so that we have sort of consistent expenditures. There could be, obviously costs will go up. We want those to be moderate each year. And then again, the Chromebooks, we're trying to select a number of grades each year so that it's the same number of devices each year. So it's just built in as a routine expenditure, and we don't see spikes like we had when we were implementing the plan.
Okay. And then the second question I had, fun fact that's not so fun. $48,000 a day in transportation alone. Connecting back to the previous conversation we had this evening, and you probably don't have this number off the top of your head, and that's totally fine. Curious as to if we're looking at trying to bring back students who are currently attending charter schools, do you have any idea of that $48,000 a day, how much of it is spent transporting students every day outside of our school boundaries to charter schools?
I do not have the answer to that question.
That would be another not so fun fact.
But recall that outside of our district wouldn't only be charters, but it would also be non-publics, because we're required to transport those. So you may not be realizing, and I'd have to consult with our transportation folks, but you may not be realizing any economies of scale because you're already taking the buses out of the district.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, we're running buses for the non-pubs.
Right.
So you may or may not have significant savings.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure.
Dr. Munson?
Yeah, I had a statement and a question. I mean, my statement was just to perhaps say out loud what is really obvious, but in the context of our previous discussion, right, our average special ed subsidy increase is 2.7% over the last few years, and our special ed cost increases averages at 8.9%. So those costs are absolutely killing the taxpayers of this district. They're just absolutely killing it, and we have to figure out a way to make that sustainable, because with these numbers, it's not sustainable. That's the statement. The question I had actually had to do with charter school costs. I appreciate the way both you have produced this plan using conservative assumptions, and also explained that as we've gone through here. But I wondered, the charter school cost assumption seemed less conservative than the others, because it seems that it's one of the rare ones where you didn't take the actual average. You took something much lower, and even the average is strongly influenced by one data point, the 18-19. The average would be far higher if it wasn't for that anomalous year. And so I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what your thinking was for that assumption.
Actually, I think that is an average. He said it wasn't an average, but it is. Otherwise, you'd be averaging 3 things less than 6 and getting 6. So it includes the 14.
It's an average of 15 through 19.
Okay, so you took out the 14, you took out the large one,
right,
but you didn't take out the small one.
No, the 14 is in there. Actually, all 4 of them are in there.
Yeah, but the average is 6.22%, but the assumption going forward is only 3.6.
Yes.
Correct.
So yeah, my question is, why did you decide to not use the average?
In general, 6.22% seemed higher than, as you can see, what we've experienced more recently. In addition, if you look at the components of charter school tuition, there's 2 components. One is the number of students. The other is our own finances are used to drive the calculation to come up with the tuition rate. Mm-hmm. And in terms of number of students, we have not seen significant increases year over year. We have seen increases, but not significant. We haven't seen spikes. So really then it comes back to that small increase, but then the growth of our own finances and what that's driving. And it's more realistic to me in the 3.6% place than it is at 6.22.
That's actually really useful. I think that's what the plan is for. But how did you specifically get the 3.6 as opposed to 3.7 or
That is
3.4?
taking out the 14.
3.6 is the average of three of those numbers, 5.29, 5.35, and 0.15.
Okay, that's where the larger one
Is taken out.
is taken out. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Ms. Bowman?
I just had a quick question, very small, but I just wanted to understand it. On page 5, line 21, under debt service, I would have thought debt service would keep going down, but then in 2021, it actually goes up before it goes down again. I was just curious why that happens.
I'm not sure, let me just go back so that the audience
looking
can
at
see
the
what we're talking about as well. I'm not sure I'm following. Can you repeat your question?
Maybe I don't understand what's in the line.
So line 21 is debt service.
Yeah, and I thought as we paid things off, the debt service would just go down linearly, but when you get to 2021 compared to the year before, it actually goes up before you get to 21, 22, then it goes back down. I was just curious why it does that.
Absolutely. You may recall that earlier this year in July or August, maybe, I think it settled in September, we refinanced some debt, and there was a savings of,
Few hundred.
there was a savings this year of roughly, we'll call it $500,000 just for ballpark. And so we took the savings up front, which reduced our debt service and the expense in the current year. And so that's why you see the current year number lower, and then it goes back up next year to where it should have been.
Okay.
What we did actually is that $500,000 was moved up into the capital reserve transfer.
Gotcha.
We transferred that. So it just sort of jumped up one line for this year to be set aside, and then it'll jump back down.
Okay, that makes
Next
sense.
year.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
Any other questions?
Okay, great,
Can you-
thank you. Okay. Moving on, we have a sheet in here that calculates the real estate tax rate. You can see, this is page 9, near the bottom, line 45, and we tend to talk to real estate taxes in terms of percentage. And so you can see the percentage increases over the last few years, ranging from 2.19, 1.640, and then the 3% where we currently stand in the current year. And then the 2.8% moving out. If you take all years, again, this is on line 45 of page 9, if you take all the years that Act 1 has been in place, and you take the adjusted Act 1 index for East Penn School District and average it, it's 2.8%. And it actually has been 2.8% the last few years, even though we've gone up and down in our index. So that's the number we use moving forward as a benchmark. The rest of the page is the calculation of that. I will tell you that at some future date, when there's more time available, this will probably become simplified, because I think it can get a little confusing for the layperson. But essentially, if you want to work through the calculation, you're welcome to, or if you'd like me to work through it with you individually, I'm happy to do that as well. On page 10, this is a new page that was added this year. And I think it's a very important page now that it's added and charted because of what we can see. This includes the real estate tax millage rates for the past 10 years, as well as the millage rate increase and the Act 1 index. In the first chart, the bars are the school district tax increase. The line is the Act 1, the adjusted Act 1 index for East Penn School District. And so you can see, I actually found this very interesting once it was charted. In the first year, the district exceeded the Act 1 index. And the next year, it was very close to the Act 1 index, and then below the Act 1 index, and then at 0. And you can see the year immediately following the 0, the district was exceeding the Act 1 index again, presumably to make up for the 0%, I'll say. And then in the second year, above the Act 1 index by like 1.1%, then at the Act 1 index, and then the past few years, we've been below, and then last year was a 0. What I will sort of step out on a limb and say is, when I see a chart like this where we keep going down and up and down and up, is as a district, as a board, we should probably look at this and start to contemplate, is there a middle line where we could we be at 1.75% or 2% every year and stay at that level year over year, rather than these fluctuations of 0 back up to a very high number, then work our way back down. So it's something to think about and consider. I think when you see it graphically, it really stands out. And then the chart at the bottom is the real estate tax millage rate. Charted out, you can see there's 3 very high bars, and then the rest are lower. The purpose of, or the reason for that is, there was a countywide reassessment that took effect in 2013-14. And in a year of reassessment, the assessments are re-equalized to be closer to market value. And so when the assessments go up, the rate has to go down in order the district needs to realize the same amount of income that they realized in the prior year, prior to considering any tax increases for that year. One other thing I wanted to mention on this particular page is, if you had printed this out or had a version from other than on board docs, the headlines, that the years were incorrect, and that was brought to our attention, so we corrected that. So what's on the screen is correct, but if you have a previous version, you'll know the years start with notice the years start with 2009, 10. So just make note of that. The data was correct. It was just the data label that was. I think I may have seen some interested hands, so I will take questions.
Mr. Jankowski?
Curious, do you have any idea where we were prior to 09, 10? Speaking of the trend you just stated, which I thought was a very valid point about, the years after a 0% increase for, that's a pretty high increase in 9, 10. Do you have any idea where we were prior to then, just from?
I don't off the top of my head. I do have the records. I have a 30-year millage history Excel spreadsheet. What we could do is actually graph it from 2006 forward, because really anything prior to Act 1 generally isn't relevant.
Yeah.
I would say also, if you go pre-2006, the district went through that growing spurt, and probably you're going to see like taxes go up, be my guess. But if that's something that interests the board, we could go back and graph that separately outside of the plan.
Yeah, I'd just be curious to see
But look at that.
how that flow was.
I would say there was also, after the recession, there were, I think, 2 years of transition funds, and then when they ran out, there was a big conundrum with the budget.
Okay.
And so
Good point, the timing
I
of
think
that,
that is
would-
around that timing of that big spike.
Sure.
That would have
No,
been-
That makes sense.
Maybe 1 year
2008 to
before that, or that year.
Sorry, I was just going to say, that'd have been like 2008 to 2010, because that was
Yeah.
when most districts were in fiscal turmoil.
But there were like 2 years where there was additional money coming in from the federal
Yep.
to offset some of the impacts of the recession, and then when that ran out in 2 years is probably around the time of the spike.
Yep. That was the federal stimulus, which I think was 2008, 2009, and then
Okay.
10 was when it went away.
Sure, okay.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay.
Next, on page 11, we have the revenues. I'm not going to go through these individually. I'll only point out one interesting thing. That's on line 23. You see from state sources, so this is a state subsidy, Social Security. If you go down a little farther to line 34, you also see Social Security reimbursement. The reason for that is, traditionally, that was assigned to what we call Function 2810, and this past year, the Pennsylvania Department of Education assigned it a new number under the basic education subsidy headline. And so now it moves up. So if you look at the current year budget, you see we budgeted for it in the lower number, the 2810. We got the guidance from PDE, and so now it will be. So if you're looking at this and you see that in two places, so again, those are lines 23 and 34. And on page 12, again, you have the revenue projections. So if there are any questions, I would take them. Otherwise, I'll move right on to expenditures.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. As I mentioned earlier, the expenditure section in this broken up a little differently than you see the way we report to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So you can see salaries broken out by broad categories of administration, instruction, custodial maintenance, support staff, and then actually tax collectors are sort of on their own for a number of reasons. Technically, they're not employees, but we still pay them through payroll. So that's why they show up here. If you go to page 16, you can see the assumptions for the future. This is on salaries and benefits. The assumptions are actually on the page rather than on the assumptions page. Looking at the box that starts on row 20, I think it's about 23, or the grid on 23, any of the percentages that are encapsulated in a box are agreements that are in place. So those are projections that are based on existing agreements. Any place where there isn't a box, essentially what we've done is just carried a number forward or made an assumption about what that would be in the future. And so the assumptions are pretty straightforward because they're tied to agreements in this case. And sure.
On the teachers, I think you used the adjusted index instead of the base index. Is
Correct.
that to account for growth in the population of teachers also, or is that just
Actually,
reflect the contract?
so for teachers, actually, if you look at for the rest of the board, the teacher's contract uses the Act 1 index as a metric to calculate the matrix, the salary guide for the following year. And there are two components to that. One is the growth of the scale, so people advancing on from one step to the next step. And the other piece is the Act 1 index. I believe.
The Act 1 index is the total. The base Act 1 index is the total growth of salary.
That's right.
I believe.
The two components total the Act 1 index. The 2.8 in future years reflects the assumed index that we're using. The 3% in the current year is actually calculated when you compare the proposed to the prior budget.
Okay.
Okay, so that is taking into account additional growth,
Growth.
additional positions, yes. Sorry about that. Moving on to the benefits, and I'll go to page 18 and we'll talk about the assumptions. Actually, before I talk about the assumptions, the group insurances, just so you have an idea of what's included in there, that includes not only the medical insurance, but also dental, life, long-term disability. They're all considered group insurances, so they're lumped together in that line item. And then generally, like the other benefits are things like the unemployment compensation expense, our custodial uniform program, and any administrative like we have the retention incentive program for administrators, and should somebody qualify for that in a given year, that's actually considered as other benefit. So in terms of the growth assumptions, we are part of the Health Benefits Consortium here in Lehigh County with the other school districts, as well as LCTI, L-Tri-C, those two. So we all pool together for the purchase of healthcare insurance. When we look at our specific trend for our group collectively, it is roughly 5%. So that's the projection as a consortium we use to project forward, and so it seems only appropriate to use that projection in our model. So that's where the 5% comes. The Social Security and retirement is actually not a projection, but a percentage of payroll. Social Security is a straight number that, has been the same number for many years, and there's no reason to believe that that won't continue for many years. The retirement actually comes from the Public School Employees Retirement System Board, meets annually in December and sets the rate for the current year, but they also approve, I don't know if they approve, but they put out actuarial calculations for future years. So these represent the figures that we receive from the Public School Employees Retirement System. In terms of workers' compensation, again, it's a percentage of payroll. We haven't seen significant fluctuations, so that 0.8% of payroll, again, we carry forward. Tuition reimbursement is an area we actually have seen some significant growth over the past couple of years. If you look at the actual figures, now I'm going back one page to 17, you can see that we went from 200,000 to 300,000 to 400, almost 500,000 to 600,000. Based on where we are in the current year, it's roughly 560,000. That could be revised. It's still relatively, it's getting later in the year, but when these numbers were put together, it was still relatively early in the year. So we're looking at that growth saying, I guess we need to anticipate continued growth. So that's where the 3%, which could be moderate. Again, anybody's guess sometimes on some of these things. And then finally, the other benefits are relatively small. We don't see significant growth like in unemployment compensation, for instance, so very small percentage on other benefits. Moving forward to district-wide instruction, just really broadly, to put this into context, the Department of Education defines this section, we call these the 1,000 functions. So as activities dealing directly with the interaction between teachers and students that can be directly attributed to the program of instruction. Very simply, I like to say it's where the student meets the teacher in the classroom. It tends to be anything that comes in direct contact with the student that isn't like an extracurricular. It's really those direct instructional programs. So again, you can look through these. There's nothing that really stands out to me. Just point out that at the bottom, there are some totals that we have put there for your benefit that are, they are included in the totals above, but they're just demonstrated in a different way. So you can see our brick and mortar charter tuition. You can see our cyber charter tuition. It's not broken out. Above, you just see it as regular ed and special ed. Here you can see the breakout. And also, special ed is comprised of a number of those items, specifically what we call the 1200s, and so we've totaled those for you at the bottom. Moving on to page 21, these are the district-wide non-instructional items. Again, these are services that provide administrative, technical, and logistical support to facilitate and enhance instruction. So these are not those for direct instructional expenses, but what you might call secondary expenses or, administrative expenses in some cases. Again, you can look over those as well as the projections. I'm going to move forward to page 25. I'm going to move past those non-instructional expenses. Move on to debt service. Again, that's page 25. And so you can see the historical debt service. Those who've been on the board, you'll recall that we had a significant debt service, quote, fall off in 2018-19. And in that year, we put in the full-day kindergarten program. And then that was about half of that. The other half we preserved by redirecting it into capital reserve. If you move on to page 26, you can see moving forward, we have some, additional debt service fall-offs. And we, continue to talk about the importance of the facility study we're going to do and what expenses may arise out of that, what facilities needs we have, what our future debt needs may be. And we will, when this debt service falls off, it becomes in an Act 1 environment where you're capped each year, and we're really feeling that this year. It becomes very important to capture these and redirect them into capital reserve for two reasons. One, you're building a down payment, if you will, on your future significant capital needs. And two, you're preserving capacity so that if you do have to go out and borrow, you're able to fit that within your current portfolio. If we don't do that, or a district that doesn't do that, what you really need to do is ramp up in years leading up to a project. So it could take upwards of 5 or 6 years to build capacity to be able to pay for debt. And then you're finally able to do a project. We certainly would be in a much better position should we just redirect this and preserve those fall-offs for future needs. We'll be able to better speak to that after we do the facility study next year. On page 27, this is the page which is the costing out of district priorities. If you look at the top, you can see that currently, as you know, there aren't any priorities included in the budget. If you look below, that's really a thorough accounting of the breakdown of those priorities. So the first thing that has been identified as the highest priority is the literacy resources. And you can see that's classified as a one-time cost. The next thing is the learning support teacher. And as I mentioned earlier, there's two components to that. You have seen generally, I think the number of 91,000, but it's really made up of two components. So there's the actual expense, but then there's the revenue piece that comes back to the district. And so in order to plug that particular priority into this plan and have this plan match up with the documents we prepare for PDE, we have to break that out and we can't net those off. So the bottom is really that accounting so that we're prepared to plug those numbers in at the point that we're able to start adding priorities to the plan. And I'm going to assume at this point, if anybody has a question, they're going to flag the chair and we'll just address them as we're moving along. Great, thank you. The next section is the capital projects plan. And as I mentioned, I added a note here, and I had mentioned this previously. A comprehensive facilities plan is slated to be completed in 2020-21, and we anticipate that the results of that plan will contribute significantly to the facilities plan. So if you look at this, we have identified projects in the immediate future. We actually have projects in the distant future, but we believe by doing that study, it will help us identify the plan when they do their thorough analysis of our building systems and other things. On page 29, this is an accounting, if you will, of the school buildings in the district, the age of the buildings, when they're last renovated, capacities, et cetera. So that's for your benefit to see, how long it's been since a building may have been built or renovated, where we are in terms of capacity. I will caution you, the student capacity is a capacity that's driven by a formula prescribed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. I'm not sure, you don't want to take that one to the bank, that student capacity, because it's formula driven and not necessarily reality driven for your local school district.
That's good.
And also the high school enrollment includes LCTI, so they're not all people actually in the facility.
Correct. And the additional comment to that is when we're talking about the calendar and we're talking about days when other, like LCTI won't be in session, all of a sudden you can see the problem that creates for the high school when those students can't report to LCTI and they're in the building. there's really, they can send them to the auditorium and they don't have capacity to spread them out throughout the building. So I think, again, these numbers help articulate that point.
Ms. Bowman, you had a question?
It looks like you don't need to do much of a study to see that 2 of the elementary schools, and even at least one of the middle schools and the high school, are basically busting at the seams. And it would be good for us to take a hard look at that and start planning what we're going to do about that now, even though I know we haven't done the population study yet. But even just conservatively looking at how many students we increase every year, and if we actually really do pull students back in with some of these alternative education programs, I understand that the student capacity isn't like set, and it's not necessarily that we have 400 too many students in the high school, but being in the high school during class change, it's pretty obvious that we have a very crowded high school. I don't know that I need a study to know that. And so I just don't know, when we say we want to study something, a couple of these just seem like we need to start looking at it right now, to me, but it's just my feeling.
Is part of that legally, we can't build extra capacity, we have to show that there's a need for the capacity?
You have to go through the
If you are applying, you're applying for funds through the state Plan Con program where you get the reimbursement. That's virtually non-existent at this point. However, yeah, you're right. There is a process. I recognize what you're saying. I think it's also very important. Those studies are very important, though, to substantiate, what you're doing. I hesitate to say, but because you all know, I mean, when you're stewards of the public's money, you have to be very methodical about how you spend it. And so I think doing those studies and doing a facility study, you're demonstrating to the community at large that you're being methodical about the process and making decisions based on solid data.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Are there other questions? Okay, please continue.
Okay, moving on to the next page, page 30. This is where you can see the accounting, if you will, of both the current year projects that are underway as well as future projects that we foresee the need for. One thing that I'll remind you on this is that, while we may scope or specify a particular project in a particular year, that's based on a roof, for instance. It's based on the average life of a roof. But we continue to monitor that, and if we believe that that can be extended longer, we certainly would push a project back a year. If it's starting to deteriorate prematurely, we certainly would need to address that further. I guess my point is that this piece of the plan, like the whole plan, but is very dynamic and can change based on actual conditions from year to year. There was a question about the factor that was used to inflate this, so I'm going to ask Mr. Anushko if he wants to address that.
Depending on the type of project, a factor was used of 3% compounding interest going forward. Now, that project would be like a roof restore. If it was a roof replacement, I would take what we spent currently on the projects that just went out for bid and we received pricing back. I took that number per square foot and multiplied it by the square footage of the roof we want to replace next year to give us a more accurate cost analysis of what we would need. If it was a boiler replacement, I would look at the boiler replacement that we took out for bid this year, and I would compare it to what the boilers are at Lincoln, and then analyze, at Lincoln, we might want to go to a gas-fired boiler instead of oil. So there might be an additional cost to have UGI run the gas line in, which was not included at West Coastville. So there's variables that we look at. Some of them that you have to look at are with roofing. With today's pricing, the oil price went down a barrel tremendously. That may or may not translate to savings for us down the road in a year from now. So there's a lot of different things that we look at, but on an average, I took the 3% and compounded it year after year on some of those other projects.
Questions? Reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Moving past the capital projects plan, we'll actually look at the financing piece. So if you look at page 33, you can see on this page at the top a summary of the general fund, the beginning balance, the revenues, the expenditures, like a very high-level summary. But what's nice is it shows you the interaction between the general fund through, seeing the transfers to the capital reserve fund. So you can see them going out of the general fund, and then below you have the general capital reserve fund summary, and you can see it coming in as a contribution to capital reserve. And then you can see, specifically on this page, historically what we have spent the capital reserve funds on, the source of the revenues that we've received, as well as the source of the revenues we've received in the capital reserve fund. If you look at, one of the things, Mr. Champagne, that you brought up in a previous meeting was looking at benchmarking, okay, what was our budget? How much did we budget for these projects, as opposed to, how much are we spending on these projects? And this is one place where you can see it, not specifically on a line item basis, but you can see it in total. So, we budgeted for projects in the current year 1.6 million roughly, and we are looking at, just making sure I'm looking at this correctly. Yeah, we're looking at about 1.499. So in total, again, I know it's not itemized, but in total, we are coming in fairly well below the budgeted number on there.
Any questions?
And I'm going to move on then to the evaluation of the combined fund balance and capital reserve targets. So in a previous year, we would talk we would talk about what are good targets in terms of our overall fund balance and in terms of our annual contribution to capital reserve. And so through a poll of similar sized school districts across the Commonwealth, these were two metrics that other districts use as benchmarks. Again, I think you have to remember they're benchmarks, they're not absolutes. But looking at, the financial, the rating agencies look for that 2 months of operating expenses in your reserve, as well as it's the government finance. The GFOA, Government Finance Officials Association, also recommends that as a best practice. So that's what we've used, and so you can see at the top on row. Sorry, you can't see it. 21. The net above or below that target that we are. And you can see how that changes over time. And I think that change over time is what's more important to look at than where we are today. So, is the trajectory correct? Is that number getting larger as a negative? Are we getting farther away from that benchmark? Or are we moving toward that benchmark? And then the benchmark below is, again, the evaluation of our annual contribution to capital reserve. Same thing in terms of this benchmark. Are we getting closer to that number, or are we getting farther away from that? Dr. Bacher, I think we have a question.
Sorry, I was looking
It's
at
okay, no
what you
problem.
were talking about. Dr. Levinson.
Yeah, so looking at the numbers, obviously, we're operating below the benchmark target. Should we be getting more aggressive in trying to get at the benchmark targets?
Well, that's a local decision, and when I say traditionally, that's in the 3 years I've been here. So for the past handful of years, the board has been somewhat conservative in terms of amassing large reserves. We've tried to manage our reserves and keep them at a similar level, so they're neither growing significantly or decreasing significantly. Those are the benchmarks that are out there. If the board wants to take a more aggressive approach, certainly we could do that. It's noted, if you read the Moody's or Standards & PORS reports that we get back when we have a bond rating done, it is noted in there that in terms of reserves, we are light for our size school district. However, there are other mitigating factors in their eyes in terms of our bond rating. So should we work toward that? I think it's probably, if it's something we want to work for, it should be a long-term goal, not something we want to accomplish next year.
And there are structural parts of the long-range plan that will help us in out years if we look at it as a long-term goal rather than trying to do something immediate.
Correct.
Any other questions?
The next portion of the plan is a scenario analysis. And so this takes a couple scenarios. The first one is assuming that there was a 0% increase in the current year and then various increases in the subsequent years, what impact does that have on the overall fund balance or the fiscal health of the school district? And so we've added these little charts because, again, a picture tells 1,000 words. So I think when you see it charted, it might have different impact than just trying to look at the numbers and draw a conclusion. The next, on page 40, this assumes an increase to the Act 1 index in the current year. And again, those various scenarios of the first one, 0% in the subsequent years, and then a percentage necessary to have a 5% fund balance in the final year, and then the assumed 2.8% that we've in the plan. And again, you can see the results of those. And they're provided for you to draw some conclusions about what, results may occur in various scenarios. We're almost at the end. The supplemental information, which I'll touch on very quickly, you have a listing of the district priorities, which you've seen in the presentations, but it's included for public and other individuals to peruse. The next page 43 is really for an individual to look at and see what the impact of various tax rates are on your individual situation. So if you take your home and you figure out where your assessed value is on this chart, you can look at what the impact of a 3% tax increase would be, what the impact of a 2% increase would be, or a 1%. So it gives various just whole percentage scenarios and gives you individually the ability to see what your individual impact would be. And then on the next page, 44, you can do that same exercise, but this will give you using the assumptions in the plan, which is right now 3% and 2.8% in the out years, what your total tax liability would be. And then finally on page 45, this is just a comparison of the current year budget to estimate at a very high level, and then the current year budget to the proposed budget at a very high level. So with that, are there any outstanding questions I can address?
Dr. Munson.
This isn't a question. This is the single most useful document that I see now as a member of the school board. So I thank you for this. And while I know it takes a long time to get through all of it, much of this I've heard before. It still is helpful to me to go through these and hear it again. So thank you.
Good. Yep. Great.
Any other comments?
Same comment.
I also appreciate the more detail you've added. It's a living document, and I agree that it's tremendously valuable to the board.
Great. Thank you. I'm sorry to take so much time, but I think the first time through, it's just important to have that overview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the district update, Mrs. Campbell.
Thank you. I wanted to begin by sharing with the board and the community an update on something that's been certainly in the media and very publicized in our community, in particular the coronavirus. And as the U.S. continues to experience an increase in the number of cases, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has responded with information and various resources for many stakeholders, including schools. About a week ago, at the end of February, the district issued a statement to our school community. In particular, we really focused on preventative measures that can be taken by everyone within our school community, as well as protocol that we ask families to follow at home. Some preventative measures that the district continues to take. Our administration receives and monitors regular updates from the CDC. We also are in regular contact with our school district physician for his guidance in maintaining a healthy school environment, and then continue to monitor those communications that are coming out at the federal, state, and local level. Our facilities department has continued its daily cleaning of classrooms with approved materials that are listed as disinfecting agents that are known to kill the human coronavirus. In addition, the district has a spray disinfecting machine that we have used before in other high-traffic, large areas such as auditoriums, gymnasiums, where there might be large groups of people who are congregating. In addition, STA, our bus company, has recently purchased a similar atomizing spray machine that will be used to regularly clean our school buses. And finally, our administrative team continues to work on a plan for providing instruction, including online as well as offline options, should there be any state-mandated changes to our school calendar. In addition to the preventative measures that are taken in our schools, we just continue to network with our community and ask that our community members adhere to protocol recommended by the PA Department of Health, including covering coughs or sneeze with your elbow, washing hands often with soap and water, or using alcohol-based hand sanitizer if soap and water are not readily available, cleaning surfaces frequently, including things such as countertops, light switches, cell phones, remotes, and other very frequently touched items. And we also ask parents and guardians that if their child is sick and running a fever, particularly a temperature greater than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that you please keep your children home from school until they're fever-free for 24 hours without using any fever-reducing medications. Our team, again, continues to monitor the situation. We are literally in the process of further communication with family members that we anticipate will go out later this week. And we just continue to remain committed to protecting the health and safety of our students, our faculty, as well as all our staff. Some celebrations that I'd like to highlight within the district. On February 20th, students from our American Computer Science Club at Emmaus High School hosted the 5th annual programming competition, referred to as EHS Code Buzz 2020. At that event, we had 18 teams from 10 different schools, and they had 3 hours to complete 10 programming problems that were designed by the following members of our EHS club. Artie Schmidt, that's a name that's probably familiar to many of our board members, as he has been here. Cameron Fanning, Jeffrey Kleinberg, Ishan Lal, and Jamie Kale. At, I believe it was our last school board meeting, we announced that the What's So Cool About Manufacturing award ceremony was coming up. And indeed, that event was held about 2 weeks ago. And a huge congratulations goes out to both of our middle school teams, in that both received an award at the What's So Cool About Manufacturing ceremony. In particular, LMMS won Outstanding Cool Award for their Smooth On video, and our IR team won the Outstanding Videography Award for their Allen Organ video. And the great piece is that both teams landed within the top 3 videos of the entire competition, and so they are advancing on to states. At the evening of the What's So Cool About Manufacturing Awards, the local career and technical schools hosted a cupcake contest before the awards ceremony. And I wanted to recognize an EHS senior who's in LCTI's electromechanical program, Damon Maurer. And Damon and his peers actually programmed a robot that served cupcakes that were created by the LCTI commercial baking students as part of that cupcake contest. So it really was just an amazing night for East Penn students. Speaking of LCTI, I'd like to congratulate the February Students of the Month from LCTI, specifically Samantha Kaiser from Carpentry, Alexis Dries from Advertising Design and Commercial Art, Matt Kirschner from the Carpentry, Chris McDonald, Commercial Banking, Damon Maurer, Electromechanical and Mechatronics Technology, and Wyatt Bieber from Electronics Technology and Nanofabrication. Thank you also to the IU and our Emmaus High School administration and teachers for collaborating on a recent event in which we hosted our local legislators. They were with us on March 2nd and had an opportunity to view some of our special ed programs at the high school, including those that we partner with at the IU. Special thanks goes out to the offices of Senator Pat Brown, Senator Lisa Boscola, Representative Ryan McKenzie, and Representative Michael Schlossberg for stopping by and joining us. 7 Emmaus High School students have been chosen to sing at the Pennsylvania Music Educators Association All-State Chorus Festival. That festival is coming up at the end of April, held at the Kalahari Resorts in Pocono Manor, and at that event, there will be more than 200 of the best high school chorus singers from across the state. And at from Emmaus High School, I'm pleased to share that we have several individuals who have made it to All-State Chorus. Rachel Knappenberger, Maya Schlesinger, Elena Slack, Danielle Potts, Reese Williams, Lorenzo Antigua, and Trevor Warren. This is the last time I think I'll make this announcement. It's about kindergarten registration. And I say that because we are very rapidly approaching the kindergarten screening event, which will be held in our buildings. But as of March 2nd, our online kindergarten registration is open, and I'm thrilled to share that parents and guardians have been certainly taking advantage of those online registration opportunities. I think as of today, Mr. Povolitis, we have 300?
It's just over 200.
Over 200 families who have already registered their students for kindergarten. And so again, just if you have a community member, a family member who has a student who will be 5 for the upcoming school year, please encourage them to sign up for our kindergarten program.
We did.
Awesome, thank you. And finally, as we get into mid-March, it is spring musical season. And so we invite the community to come out and enjoy some of the amazing performances that our middle and high school students will perform. In particular, March 12th through 14th, so this week, our students will perform Mulan Jr. March 18th through the 22nd, next week, Emmaus High School will present Hello Dolly. And finally, the following week, March 16th through the 28th, LMMS will perform Emma, a pop musical. So for all of you showgoers, please take advantage of one or all of those great performances. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Mrs. Campbell? Okay, moving on. Next, we have the student-teacher calendar. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
The discussion, there was one change.
Yes, one change in that, is it the May date? The May Act 80 day was moved from May 7th to Friday, May 28th. And we appreciate the feedback that now puts that early dismissal. Again, we value the professional development time with teachers, but that puts that early dismissal after AP testing as well as standardized testing at the secondary level.
Is there any discussion from the board? Dr. Munson?
Yeah, I have one quick question, which absolutely know for sure you have answered before, and I looked through my notes in past years, I cannot find it. I know that the PA state minimum for student days is 180, so we have a calendar that's listed as 4 above that state minimum number. But additional days in the summer kick in after just 3 inclement weather days rather than 4. And I can't remember what the explanation is for that 1-day discrepancy.
Doug, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
So you're correct, and we have the 184 that are built in, but then there's the 3 snow days that are built in, so that takes you down to 181. And we looked at consolidating that, but just the administrative team did not feel comfortable with the hours and going down just for some flexibility with that additional day there.
Part of the explanation is, as Doug explained, the state requirement is the 180 days as well as the hour piece. So 900 at the elementary level, 990 at the secondary level. And so as an organization, the additional day, in the past, it used to be 2 days, but the additional day certainly gives us what I would describe as some wiggle room to be sure that we meet those hour requirements as well.
If there's an early dismissal or something.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, yeah. Any kind of emergency or something that would come up, we have an extra day.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anything else? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Winch? Aye. Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to personnel items, may I have a motion for items 1 through 10?
So moved. Second?
Any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Winch? Aye. Ms. Bowman?
Aye.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to business operations, if there's no objection to taking all 4 items in
I've
one.
got one question on item C.
You can still ask
I
questions.
guess I can do that, yeah. Yep.
Okay. May I have a motion for all 4, A through D?
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Jankowski.
So in the amendment to the contract with LVHN, in the scoreboard, it talks about, states that the scoreboard will have significant LVHN branding. I'm just curious, what's the term, what's considered significant branding, and what potential cost impact will that have? Has there been any analysis done on that?
Not
We
yet.
completely removed by this amendment, we've removed whatever was said in the original agreement, so there's really no parameters now around what this branding will be, or, like I said, cost allocation.
Correct. In essence, what this allows us to do is to take the $100,000 that had been earmarked specifically for a scoreboard, divert that to the field. This does still maintain, I'm going to say, sort of the essence or the component of the original agreement, that there would be branding on the LVHN scoreboard. And the process that we followed in the past, meaning in terms of determining branding, for example, logos on the field, it was a collaborative process between administration and district administration and LVHN administration, so that ultimately both parties are comfortable with that branding.
So we've already established what that branding is going to look like?
We have not.
Okay, and that's just my concern is, it doesn't seem like there's really much room for branding right now on their scoreboard, and, what they consider significant may differ from what we consider significant, and again, I'm just concerned that there's not clarity around here, or even a mutually agreeable provision in here, so that, they're not requiring us to spend, money that we haven't otherwise put aside for this, or make alterations to the scoreboard to provide for branding that they may deem to be significant.
Correct. The discussion has been that the existing scoreboard will remain, so in essence, but it would be adding on panels of some sort that could then advertise the LVHN.
Mr. Champagne?
Well, I have the same question, but I guess regardless of, I mean, I would love to see significant defined, but I guess we're not going to get it defined. But I would assume whatever we do is going to fit within the budget we approved. So that should be an upper bound and not to exceed the contingency. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And then on item 5, what is this? Is this just a catch-all to put others, they can put other stuff on the field to, like portable LVHN banners and the such? Is that?
It is a catch-all, and the magic words, "as the parties shall agree," appear there.
Oh, yeah, okay. It would have been nice to have that as in part of 3, but we are where we are. So, thank you.
Any other discussion or questions or comments? Ms. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Winch?
Aye.
Ms. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion's pass. Moving on to curriculum, may I have a motion for educational conferences?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Jankowski?
Aye.
Dr. Levinson?
Aye.
Dr. Munson?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Ms. Winch?
Aye.
Ms. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Champagne?
Aye.
Dr. Bacher?
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to a first reading of policy updates. Mr. Provolitis, would you like to walk us through the?
Sure. Okay. Good evening. So I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the draft policies under review. First are the policies related to tobacco and vaping products. Act 93 of 2019 and Act 111 of 2019 made modifications to the Pennsylvania Crimes Code regarding the use and sale of tobacco and vaping products on school property. Both acts contain similar language, resulting in the modifications to the school code. So as a result, we have updated definitions and provisions in draft policies. It's policy 222, 323, 707, and 904. So in each of those policies, the recommended language is specifically added as a result in the changes in the law. I did have some feedback regarding this policy. So there was a request for recommended language that's specifically added. If you look at the bottom of page 2 of 4 in policy 222, the first policy, there's questions about the very bottom. It says tobacco product does not include, and then number 2 there, just some specific questions about, I think, kind of making it a little bit easier to read. And so the recommendation was just to add something like medical marijuana products instead of a device included under the definition, so on and so forth. So reaching out to PSBA and getting some advice from their policy team, they just thought that the exclusion comes directly from the law, meaning this language, and they would be very careful to look at that or to remove the language that was suggested. But again, that's up to the board, and they suggested reaching out to our solicitor, and so I'll do that. The second item as well was in the same area, the note that's added at the end in the exact same paragraph there. It says, note, guidance issued by the PA Department of Health directs, and so on. In particular, they said that to change any language, they would consult with a solicitor because there are specifics that go beyond what the recommended change was there. And so if the board wants to change that language and the solicitor is okay with it, they don't recommend it, but that's something that we could look into.
Okay. I just made the recommendation and I thought it was confusing the way that was written.
Yeah, I agree.
What it's actually saying, so.
Yeah, I agree, but they said that's kind of packaged together with the law. And so if you miss a few pieces from that, it could be misleading. And so that's kind of where it was. And I'll talk to Mr. Fisher about that.
Okay. Are there?
And then moving on to policy
Oh,
810.
if we have a question for
Oh,
the
I'm sorry.
existing one. Mr. Jankowski?
Just a couple questions / comments on the structure. And so, we lead off with talking about tobacco and vaping products, including Juul and other. But below in the definition of both the state law definition of tobacco products and also how we define tobacco products in here, it already captures that, so that it's kind of redundant. And I would suggest that either we expand Part 2 under tobacco products to specifically include vaping products. My concern with calling it out up here is we don't know how this electronic cigarette, vaping, how this industry may change or expand, or other devices that may be introduced into the market. So by just simply calling out vaping products above and Juul, it seems like it would be better to have the broader definition as we lay out the definition below and just define everything as the state does and as we already do as tobacco products.
Okay, you can.
And then on page 3, and that comment actually rolls through to the other policies that have the same language in here. I believe there were 3 or 4 total that use this same terminology and definitions. Under authority, and this is a question, so are the STA buses considered owned, leased, or, I guess, are they considered owned, leased, or controlled by the school district for purposes of capturing this prohibition?
Yes.
So
Controlled by.
So they are controlled by us?
Yes.
Okay. And then under guidelines, technically, these aren't guidelines. They're really more, disciplinary actions or rights. So I think.
Where are we for guidelines?
I'm sorry, page 4.
Okay.
So my first suggestion would be to change that from guidelines to, and I apologize for not having a better word.
We can look at it.
And I don't know if we want to say repercussions or
Consequences.
or something to that effect. And then I would suggest under the first paragraph, the second line where we say if convicted, we change that to may. And that's more consistent with the second sentence where we say the court may admit the student to an adjudication alternative. Same with here. We don't know what the school might do. So I don't want to tie this to the extent that the school might take disciplinary action in one situation that doesn't take in the other, that there's some type of precedent set. We kind of want to leave that discretion with the administration in order to what actions they may or may not, depending on the severity of the incident. So I would suggest changing that to may instead of shall.
Okay.
I'm sorry, and then above, under law enforcement incident report, on the second line, I would suggest we say by students in or on school property, because under authority, we talk about the prohibition and use of the products in a school and then later on school property. So just kind of making everything tied together, say in or on.
Okay.
Similar language. Okay.
Thank you.
And those comments flow through, like I said, to the code 323 and the others. So.
Are there any other comments on the first, Mr. Champagne?
Just on the first one, or?
Yeah, I think he's going to do
Oh, okay.
a header
I'm
for the
fine.
other ones also. Dr. Munson?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to follow up on, I didn't see I followed 90% of what you said when you were summarizing the suggestions for simplifying and the clarifying language. I guess I just want to speak in favor of making the language more simple and clarifying, even if it's not taken directly out of the law, as long as the solicitor can tell us that we're not, that it isn't violating the law. Because, I mean, number one, I don't think anyone will be surprised that we take far more care in our policies than perhaps those who are voting on the laws in Harrisburg do. But also because, one of the things I learned from the big time we spent on policies a number of years ago was that these policies are something that staff have to look at a lot and have to be able to make decisions on the basis of that. And so to the degree that we don't have to have them trying to decipher legalese and we can have straightforward statements, I think that that's useful. And it's, of course, not surprising that PSBA would not suggest changing them. These are, I mean, they've given us their suggestions. So, if we say, well, can we change your suggestions? They're not going to say, I mean, they'll say, it's up to you, but these are our suggestions.
Unless there's a legal reason why.
Yeah. So, I guess I don't think that we should use the fact that PSBA doesn't recommend it to be dispositive in this case.
I agree. And I apologize. I could have read through all of it. I was just kind of trying to summarize the fact that the recommendation was for that one exclusion there, that one statement, the exclusion, to just kind of pull it together and say something like, all marijuana products. And so just PSBA just said, be careful. The board adopts their own policy, but just be careful, talk with a solicitor, because the language that was put together by the team was specific as to make sure that the letter of the law was followed, and you weren't excluding anything that would let you, allow someone that would read this and there'd be missing pieces. Then, of course, there's litigation reasons and things like that. And so I can read it if you'd like me to, the specific request, or talk to Mr. Fisher and
No, I mean, I think it makes
feedback.
sense to talk to Mr. Fisher first, and then on the second reading, we can
discuss.
check out the outcome, yeah.
Sounds good.
Any other comments or questions? And moving on to.
Okay, so basically 222, 323, 707, and 810.1, and 904, as I explained, they were all kind of related to tobacco and vaping products. So then moving on to 810.1, commercial driver's license, drug and alcohol clearinghouse. So the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration issued a final rule effective on January 4th of 2017 to establish a commercial driver's license, drug and alcohol clearinghouse. So how does this impact East Penn? As far as bus drivers, STA's third-party drug and alcohol testing partner, DSI Incorporated, is populating the drug and alcohol clearinghouse to ensure that there's compliance there. So everything is in shape as far as bus drivers go. And then we do not currently have any commercial motor vehicles that require a CDL license here. And so although we have this policy in place, we are good to go in our practice currently.
Are there any questions or comments from the board?
And I apologize. I do have other comments on 323, but I can do that after we're finished here.
Oh.
But I do have a comment on was it policy 810.1? So this talks about, I mean, the focus of the electronic device and the prohibitions are really around writing, sending, receiving, or reading text. And since we're taking this opportunity to update this, the use of mobile phones now with all the social media apps like, Twitter, Facebook, everything else, and the number of people who are using these apps, do we want to take this opportunity to expand this? Because my reading of this, it kind of still goes back to just like texting someone or calling someone. But, I've seen situations of drivers, big commercial buses on their phone, and they're, I'm close enough that I could see that they're like texting someone tweeting someone. So I don't know if this is the time that, or you want to use this opportunity to.
Yeah, this would be the time, sure. Yeah, we can look at that.
So that would be and then under authority, the fourth paragraph, same thing there. It talks about prohibiting covered drivers from texting and using a handheld mobile phone, or we might want to just expand somehow, just so it's clear that this is like that phone should be down, period. It shouldn't be, not just for texting, not just for calling. And I know it's stating the obvious, but sometimes you need to state the obvious to avoid any ambiguities or as someone trying to find a loophole around disciplinary action.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments? You want to go back to the other policies?
Yeah. So under, this is, sorry, policy 323. So under authority, this is on page 2 of 3 of that policy. It talks about, the board prohibits use of tobacco vaping products by district employees at any time while responsible for the supervision of students during school-sponsored activities. Is there do we have to limit that to just when the employee is supervising students? Or can we just say at participation or supervision at a school-sponsored activity off property? Because again, looking for technicalities, my concern is I'm an employee, but I'm just here. I'm attending. I'm not supervising anyone. And I've got, a cigarette or an e-cigarette or a Juul. I mean, we don't want that. We don't want that at all, regardless of why you're there.
Would that fall under, if they're not attending as an employee, would that fall under the general prohibition of public using tobacco products at
School events.
Is that why it's limited in here, that this is specifically for employees?
I mean, I think we could do both. I mean, I
Okay.
think we,
Just to be clear.
yeah,
Okay.
just to be clear. So I think you're correct. For the general public, it's also prohibited, but I don't, I mean,
You don't see a
talk to
reason
Mr.
not to
Fisher
put it
about
in
it, but
here.
adding it one line in there just to make it a catch-all, I see is probably a good idea.
Okay. Or we could even reference the policy for the public and say, by the way, you're also prohibited if
Yeah.
you're intending not in a supervisory capacity. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this policy? And was there another policy in here, the 707?
No, I'll rest.
Okay. Okay, is that all the policies then? All the
It is.
feedback? Great. And we'll look forward to the changes at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Moving on to LCTI. Mr. Champagne,
Yes,
do you
I'll
have
make
a
this very
report?
quick. We had a meeting on February 26th. We had a presentation by Derek Savage, who is now directing the Emerging Digital Media and Social Communications Program. He is a Howard University and American Film Institute graduate and also an adjunct professor at Drexel. And I think his long-term goal, as he's had for a number of years in education, is developing an in-house production studio for media programs at LCTI that would be available to all of the districts, both for the students attending at LCTI, but also after hours. So it was a very ambitious goal, but I think he's probably the person that could make it happen. The welding lab, minor safety-related closeout items are being addressed, and the students should be in the lab this month if they're not already there. Budget approvals, all the districts but Allentown had approved the budgets. Allentown's vote was to be on 2/27th. I looked on their website and I could not find whether they had approved it or not, but I assume they will. And then senior recognition night for students at LCTI is scheduled for May 28 at the PPL Center. That's my report.
Are there any questions for Mr. Champagne? Thank you for your report. Moving on to announcements, there was an executive session at 7 PM before this meeting where we discussed negotiation, confidentiality, and real estate matters. The next regularly scheduled board meeting will be here on Monday, March 23rd at 7:30 PM. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting's adjourned.